Good afternoon. This year marks the 75th anniversary of Women's Christian College, a higher educational institution that had been the loving brainchild of two extremely courageous and dedicated visionaries, Miss Stella Bosch and Miss Niroj Bashini Shom, whose lasting contribution have immortalized their names in the annals of our institutional history. History tells us that women in general have had to face eulogy and denigration in equal measures across both spatial and temporal divides. Pitted against the severest of adversities, women have often been left traumatized, brutalized, and victimized, although the luckier few amongst them have nonetheless gone on to scale newer heights and win accolades for themselves despite the odds. The question before us today is whether Cleo does indeed remember her daughters, or are the latter deliberately obliterated from general collective memory? Does their selfless heroism and supreme sacrifice in the war front, or their humanitarian commitment as zealous missionaries, stand the test of time? Do their pictorial constructs, ranging from divinity to obscenity, in the world of media, both print and otherwise, empower or commodify them? Or are the nonconformists from amongst them best relegated to the world of the marginalized other? These are basically the thrust areas within our broad theme of women in history, around which our distinguished speakers have agreed to shed light upon. And on behalf of the Department of History and Team IQAC of Women's Christian College, I take this opportunity to express our sincerest gratitude to each and every one of them. To my respected teacher, Professor Samita, Vere Harmsworth, Professor of Imperial and Naval History, Trinity College, University of Cambridge. To our good friend and well-wisher, Professor Andrew Chandler, Professor of Modern History, University of Chichester. To my respected senior, Professor Maitreyi Sengupta, Senior Faculty Member, Retired, Department of History, Shri Shikshayatan College. Our dearly beloved student and now a college teacher in her own right, Dr. Amrita Boshu Roy Choudhury, State-Aided College Teacher, Department of Women's Studies, Lady Brabon College. And to my dear young colleague, Dr. Promiti Chatterjee, Assistant Professor in our own department. And last but not the least, certainly, to Professor Shuranjan Das, Honorable Director, and to Professor Sharmani Gupta, Professor in Asian Literary and Cultural Studies, Netaji Institute for Asian Studies, without whose prompt cooperation this webinar would have remained incomplete. But before signing off, I would like to place on record our heartfelt gratitude to our Honorable Principal, Madam Dr. Ajanta Paul, who has, as always, remained the main motivator behind all college events, both academic and otherwise. Her encouragement and enthusiasm have indeed been contagious for us all. This international webinar, which is a first for the Department of History, has been no exception. I would also like to express our gratitude to each and every member of our college governing body, especially our Honorable President, Dr. Kollan Mandi, our Honorable Vice President, Srimati Shagorika Banerjee, and to our Honorable Secretary, Madam Dr. Ratna Pandey, for kindly consenting to grace this occasion. I am also grateful to every single member of the audience, teaching faculty, non-teaching and support staff, as well as students, both from within our college and outside. And before handing over the mic to ma'am, I would just make a few requests before our listeners. Firstly, listeners are requested to use the chat box only for asking very pertinent, brief and precise questions. As I requested earlier on, please keep your audio and video in a muted form, and there will be no feedback link provided in the chat box, but the feedback link will be mailed to individual email IDs after our webinar is over. So having said that, I would now like to request our Honorable Principal, ma'am, to please deliver her welcome address. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Navnita. It is indeed a privilege and pleasure for me to be called upon to deliver the welcome address. I welcome all of you to this webinar on Women in History, organized by the Department of History and the Internal Quality Assurance Cell of Women's Christian College in collaboration with the Netaji Institute of Asian Studies. One of the several programs to mark the 75th anniversary of our college. This is indeed a special academic endeavor, at once national and global in participation and perspective. And what better way than a webinar such as this to pay tribute to the founders of Women's Christian College, Kolkata, namely Miss Stella Bose and Miss Nirojbashini Shom, founder, principal and secretary respectively, on the platinum jubilee of the institution they founded and nurtured. Both women, with their pioneering vision and vibrant energy, occupy an important position at the source of several traditions, namely pedagogical initiatives by Indian women in pre-independence times, women's higher education in independent India, and indigenous educational enterprise by the Protestant Christian community in West Bengal, resulting in the creation of an ecumenical institution such as Women's Christian College, which incidentally is the only Protestant women's college in the state. After that brief introduction to our institutional inception and jubilee, I welcome our illustrious speakers. I begin with our keynote speaker, Professor Shomita Sen, Vere Harmsworth Professor of Imperial and Naval History, Trinity College, University of Cambridge. It is indeed a privilege for us to have you here with us, ma'am, and an honor to be able to listen to you. It is very kind of you to share your valuable time, presence, and insights with us. I next welcome Professor Andrew Chandler, Professor of Modern History at University of Chichester, who has been in talks with our history department for quite some time now over various academic proposals, and is virtually, no pun intended here, a member of the college family by now. I welcome our other speakers, Professor Maitreyi Sengupta, former Associate Professor of History in Shri Shikshayatan College, Kolkata, Ms. Amrita Basu Roy Chaudhary, State-Aided College Teacher, Department of Women's Studies, Lady Brabourne College, and Dr. Promiti Chatterjee, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Women's Christian College, and wish them the best for the presentations later in the evening. I also welcome Professor Sharwani Guptu, Professor of Asian Literary and Cultural Studies, Netaji Institute for Asian Studies, for extending institutional collaboration on this project and adding thereby another dimension altogether to the webinar. It is my privilege to welcome the members of the college governing body and thank them for their kind participation. It is most gracious of them to share their valuable time with us and thereby motivate us, as indeed they invariably do. I welcome all our esteemed participants from various colleges and universities who are here with us this evening. All my colleagues from the college, that is the host institution, teaching and non-teaching, especially the former, members of the alumni, former colleagues, and all distinguished guests and well-wishers who have joined in, not to mention our students whose enthusiastic attendance invariably spurs us on to organize further academic ventures. My address will remain incomplete if I do not mention the great efforts taken by the members of the History Department and the IQAC of the college to organize this most prestigious event, the present webinar, which has been quite some time in the making and is taking place today primarily because of the participation of our esteemed speakers and also because of the devotion of the members of the history department to the cause of academic enrichment of the department and the college, come what may. I say come what may because we are all aware of the present situation and the limitations enforced on one as a result of it. I bring my remarks to a close with a few lines from path-breaking American poet Adrienne Rich's famous poem, Diving into the Wreck. I quote, "I came to explore the wreck. The words are purposes. The words are maps. I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail." Unquote. Despite the preponderance of ruin and damage in the world in general, and in women's lives in particular down the ages, I believe that there are surely some treasures that will prevail. I bring my speech to a close on that note of hope and optimism, and with my best wishes for a hugely successful webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a warm welcome to our speakers and for the note of hope and optimism that you shared with us. We are really grateful to you, ma'am, for everything that you've done for us. Now, we would like to request our Secretary, ma'am, Dr. Ratna Pandey, to share a few words with us.
A very good, yes, thank you. A very good afternoon to all of you. I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to attend this very special international webinar on women in history, organized by the Department of History and Team IQAC in collaboration with Netaji Institute for Asian Studies. The subject of the webinar is indeed an interesting one, as women and their empowerment is a very relevant topic in the present world scenario. I congratulate the Principal, Dr. Ajanta for her encouragement and support to make the webinar a reality. I'm deeply thankful to all our erudite scholars who will now enrich our knowledge by their address on the issue of women in the past. I express my heartfelt thanks and congratulations to the History Department and IQAC team of the college, to the Netaji Institute for Asian Studies, and all the distinguished guests, as well as our dear students present in the webinar, for your brilliant endeavor and participation to translate the webinar into a reality and success. I wish you all the very best in your life. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your warm words of encouragement for the department and IQAC. I would now like to begin with our inaugural session, and for that I would like to request Professor Shorbani Guptu, ma'am, to chair the session and to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Samita Sen. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Navonita. Thank you very much for proposing our involvement in this excellent program that you have organized. Thank you to the principal, Dr. Ajanta Pal, not only for her warmth during our negotiation period, but this excellent lecture that you, welcome address that you gave. It was truly inspiring and excellent. I really would like to leave this the topic to be discussed by Professor Samita Sen, because nobody can do it better than her. But I will, I have to do myself the honor of introducing her to all the students who may not be aware of all her achievements. So in very short, I will just give you a summary. Professor Samita Sen received a PhD from Cambridge University in 1992 and was JRF at Trinity College between 1990 and 94. She taught at Calcutta University and Jadavpur University between 1994 and 2018. In this period between 2013 and 2015, she served as the first Vice Chancellor of the Diamond Harbour Women's University and was Dean, Faculty of Interdisciplinary Studies of Jadavpur University between 2016 and 18. Her monograph, Women and Labour in Late Colonial India, won the Trevor Rees Prize in Commonwealth History. She has published extensively on gender and labor. Her specialization is colonial South Asia, but she has also done contemporary and interdisciplinary research on issues such as domestic violence and labor in the informal sector. Besides her academic achievements, many of us know that Samita Sen has also been very closely associated with the women's movement, having given the leadership to the School of Women's Studies in Jadavpur University, as well as through her writing. Her research interests are, she has been active internationally as well, participated in governmental and non-governmental fora of the Beijing Conference in 1995, and she has been a member of a Calcutta-based voluntary association of women, Shikshayatan, since 1983. South Asian history and society, global history, colonialism and post-colonial studies, gender studies, labor studies, education, especially higher education, migration, women's movement, trade union movements have been her research interest in the past years. And today she has a very brilliant topic, a provocative one, as she calls it, for you all, looking back from Shaheen Bagh to when a Sultana dreamt one night. Over to you, Samita Sen, for what promises to be an excellent lecture.
Thank you, Sharbani. Thank you, Nabonita, and the principal, Dr. Paul, and the secretary, Ratna Pandey, for these kind and welcoming words. And it gives me great pleasure to be with you today from far away in Calcutta. I will start. I have a PowerPoint which is fairly critical to this talk. So I will now try and do the technological thing. Let me try. Okay, so let me start. Let me just say that when I was planning this talk and I looked at the program, I felt some pain and pleasure in equal measure. Pleasure because I was thinking back to when I began my research in the mid-1980s, when women's history was such a narrow field and so little width, breadth in the topics we could do or was open to us to do. And to this position today, where we have in one webinar topics as widely differentiated as ghosts in the 19th century, missionaries and militaries in the 20th century, and contemporary advertisements now, post-pandemic. So that also is the measure of pain, because how do you write a keynote that would cover this incredible variety? And I decided then that the best thing for me to do was to address one aspect of what we have today as a program, and that is the time scale. The fact that within the rubric of women's history, we now consider very contemporary issues to also be covered. So it is from that perspective that I decided to do this talk. It adds another layer of complexity to your mix of topics today. And the only way in which it addresses the program is by the long view. But I also chose the minority theme, thinking about the 75 years of Women's Christian College. Though it is about Muslims rather than about Christians. And I also thought today, when we are faced with the very the incredible farmers' protests, that the theme of protest would perhaps be appropriate for the webinar. So all these reasonings went into the choosing of this topic, which is not going to be a paper, it's a talk, and it just sort of raises certain issues for us to think about, issues to do with women and religion, women and minority status in the context of India. So you all know that Begum Rokeya wrote The Sultana's Dream in 1904. It is a text of, it's a feminist utopia. Rokeya, and this text, in fact, is not religious in any way. And it came very early in feminist movement. It should be noted, it's the Begum Rokeya thing is also of great relevance because her birth anniversary is around now. And Begum Rokeya had articulated fairly strong feminist proposition very early in the movement. And she wrote Sultana's Dream before all the better known feminist utopias across the world, not just in the context of India. In fact, in the Indian context, we have almost no other feminist utopia. But some of the more famous feminist utopias of the past, for instance, Charlotte Perkin Gilman's Herland, was written in 1915. I think that is more or less the first that is considered in the feminist sort of iconography. So in a sense, Sultana's Dream is one of the very early, maybe even the first feminist utopia. So I wanted to flag that. Now, what does Rokeya say in Sultana's Dream? First, we should note that it's not a universalist text. It's on the contrary, there is a strong cultural specificity because it addresses centrally the issue of gender segregation. In Sultana's Dream, Ladyland is a land ruled by women. And she addresses the question of parda frontally. So parda for women is called zinana. She uses a male equivalent of the term, which she calls mardana. Now, mardana is usually a term used to denote manliness or masculinity. And to her, mardana becomes, in her writing, mardana becomes the solution to the problem of aggressive masculinity. So men are kept confined in the mardana so that women may inhabit the public domain in safety. And one of the quotes from the text is, "You do not think it wise to keep sane people inside an asylum and let loose the insane." I remember when I read this when I was very young, it struck me a blinding blow that, this is common sense at its best. But Ladyland in Rokeya's imagination, ruled by women with men in confinement, meant that it was a society that was harmonious, it had social order, and was prosperous and flourishing. So this was how Rokeya imagined a world of women. Now, from this moment, we moved to 1929, which was the Sarda Act, the Child Marriage Restraint Act, where for the first time and very powerfully, women themselves were the bill was proposed by Sarda, and he steered it through the council. But his hand was strengthened considerably by the fact that women lobbied for this act collectively. The AIWC, particularly the All India Women's Conference, worked up and down the country in order to mobilize opinion in favor of the Sarda Act. And Geraldine Forbes, in her Modern India, Women in Modern India, notes that this was a remarkable moment of unity among Hindu and Muslim women. And this was required because at one stage of the discussion on the bill, Muslim religious leaders claimed that this bill would be against the Sharia. And without the support of Muslim women, it may have been difficult for the bill to combat this kind of opposition. There was opposition from all communities. It's not that only the Muslims opposed it. But the Muslim claim that this was against the Sharia would have been more difficult to challenge if Muslim women had not themselves mobilized in favor and against this proposition. Now, the passage of the Child Marriage Restraint Act, ultimately without exception for the Muslim community, however, meant, and some scholars have argued this, that it provided the impetus for Muslim community to then embark on a series of reforms in their personal law. So two major acts were passed then after this in the 1930s. One was the Muslim Women's Divorce Act, and one was the Sharia Application Act. And it is, in a way, important that to note for our purpose today that this law that meant, that intended social reform was responded to by the community with reform within their own personal law. Now, you may also know that the Sarda Act was one act among a plethora of acts in the 1920s and 30s. These legislations covered a wide field: marriage, divorce, property, and these are a slew of legislations that Bhashati Chakraborty in her PhD thesis in 2016 calls the second social reform movement. It gathered momentum in this period, leading finally, because there were so many piecemeal laws being proposed and debated and highly contested, some of them, that finally with AIWC's lobbying, the colonial government was persuaded to appoint a committee which would consider the whole question of looking at family law and suggesting reforms. But in the initial phase, this was only for the Hindu personal law. And this committee, called the Rao Committee, was appointed in the 1940s. Soon after its appointment, we had the Quit India movement, and the women's movement was divided on the issue of the Rao Committee. Gandhi's supporters, women like Sarojini Naidu or Sucheta Kriplani, they felt that they had to respond to Gandhi's call and the Rao Committee had to also be boycotted. And very few women were able to stand out against this position. Very famously, one woman was Muthulakshmi Reddy, who argued that women had waited so long for this moment when family law would be reformed that they could not afford to boycott the Rao Committee. They had to work with the Rao Committee to influence the committee to in terms of what reforms they would undertake. And you also know that this finally the Rao Committee's work and its report resulted in a proposal to undertake fairly thoroughgoing reform in Hindu law, which was to be the Hindu Civil Code after independence. But there was so much opposition to the Hindu Civil Code in the independent India, the Constituent Assembly and then the Parliament, that ultimately it could not be passed. It had to be split into several separate acts and was passed. And these were passed. These pertain to marriage, divorce, property, inheritance, guardianship of children, etc. Now, this was an interesting moment. So this was 1955, 1956, when Hindu law was reformed, when all these acts were passed. And this is an interesting moment. If we look at Geraldine Forbes, Flavia Agnes's work, then Flavia Agnes points out that until this point, until 1955-56, it is Hindu women who were the worst off. They had the least rights within Hindu law. Compared to Hindu women, Muslim women, they had some similar problems. For instance, one major problem that was shared by women, Hindu and Muslim women, but not by Christian women, was the problem of male polygamy. But within that framework, Muslim women had more rights than Hindu women did, because Muslim women had the right of divorce, they had rights of maintenance, they had some rights of inheritance, none of which Hindu women had. But the laws of 1955-56 changed that. Hindu women now became part of a new progressive narrative of the nation. And Muslims became typecast as backward and subject particularly to a community patriarchy. And this helped Hindu men to take the position of saving the Muslim women against Muslim men. So there's a similar kind of dynamic to the colonial period, when white men wanted to protect brown women from brown men. You had now a situation where Hindu men were offering to protect Muslim women against Muslim men. But personal law was not their only problem. There are issues of social and economic deprivation, lack of being left behind in education and employment. So the general disadvantages were downplayed, and community patriarchy was emphasized as the way to explain the backwardness of Muslim women in post-independence India. The debates on Muslim personal law came to a head in 1985 with the Shah Banu controversy. I will not say too much about the case itself. It was a divorce case. Shah Banu sued her husband, who had married again and wished to divorce her, for maintenance. And in the Indian law, there is a provision for maintenance in the CRPC, in the criminal code. And Shabanu argued that she was entitled to maintenance under this code, which is not subject to personal law. She lost in some of the lower courts and then finally won in the Supreme Court. Now, what is interesting is that in passing the judgment in the Supreme Court, Justice Chandler not only gave Shabanu the maintenance she had demanded, but also made some extra comments which were not required to be made by the case on the issue of a uniform civil code, arguing that the Muslim personal law victimized, disadvantaged Muslim women, and that this problem could only be solved by passing a uniform civil code. This, as a result, pitted the possibility of a uniform civil code, or the lobbying for a uniform civil code, against minority rights. Through this process, through the Shabanu judgment, Muslim personal law and UCC became conflictual issues. The Muslim, many Muslim organizations at that time protested against the Shabanu judgment. And Muslim Personal Law Board challenged this judgment also. After some debate, the Rajiv Gandhi government brought an act which was to nullify, to overturn this judgment and its consequences, following pressure from Muslims. And this deepened the controversy. So, because of the Shabanu case, the question of uniform civil code became relegated to some unforeseeable future. And the women's movement also understood that to espouse the cause of uniform civil code was to threaten the minority identity. And Muslim women also found it difficult to come on board on the UCC platform. So gradually there grew a consensus. It's not a consensus really, but a kind of resigned acceptance that the Uniform Civil Code cannot be achieved, and the best solution may be for each community to improve, to reform their personal law within each community. So reform from within was the slogan that the women's movement adopted. And this became possible to do very soon in the Christian community. So soon after Shabanu, late 1980s and early 1990s, the Christian women's groups came together to lobby for change within Christian personal law. And it took 10 years or more for all the denominations among the Christians to be brought together. But finally, in 2001, considerable advance was made and some reform happened within Christian law. So it remained only the Muslim personal law, which kind of then became this, one personal domain of personal law, which had not been reformed. And there was not enough demand from within Muslim community for reform to make this a powerful force, to make the demand for reform a powerful force, until the turn of the century. And it is in the new millennium that we got the establishment of several Muslim women's organizations, which began to advocate for law reform within Muslim personal law. I'm not reading out the names on the slide, you can see them. And the first question that came up for these Muslim women's organizations looking at the question of personal law is the question of triple talaq. Again, I'm not going to go into much detail about this. It is well known what triple talaq is, that you can say utter talaq 3 times, and that there is no, by and large, no procedure has to be followed for divorce to take effect. And there has been considerable discussion that this was often done in heat. It was done without due consideration. And this was when phones came, it was done by phone. Now with smartphones, it is done in electronic form. And this has been of considerable debate and controversy for many years now. And this was, the issue came to a head when 5 women brought cases in court against triple talaq. And I have the names and pictures of these 5 women here. And finally, in 2017, the Supreme Court deemed instant triple talaq unconstitutional. And they asked the government to bring a legislation to ban the practice. And this is not a very remarkable ask, because such kind of instant triple talaq is in fact prohibited in many Muslim countries as well. In 2019, the Indian Parliament did bring a law which made triple talaq illegal. Now, this was controversial for a range of reasons. First, of course, some Muslim organizations considered it wrong for either the court or the Indian Parliament to have to intervene in Muslim personal law. Rightly or wrongly is a secondary question. The very right of these bodies to intervene in a matter that should be an internal matter of the Muslim community, that itself was challenged. But the political context is also important. The political context is that of a BJP government, which has an aggressive anti-Muslim agenda. So the fact that it is a BJP majority parliament that passed this law made the question even more complicated. And to cap the issue, it was argued very soon after that the elections, in fact, in which the BJP won a resounding victory, was supported by Muslim women, partly because of the triple talaq issue. But the law itself was criticized on several grounds, which is not to do with the bigger political scenario, but the actual details of the law. So many people who thought a law against triple talaq was not, it was itself not a problem, nevertheless thought that the way this law was formulated was problematic, because one major thing that this law did was to criminalize triple talaq. So that additional element in the law was criticized by a lot of people who thought that, first that it would allow governments to victimize Muslim men. Second, the question that often is raised in case of laws of this kind is that how does it help the wife if the husband is arrested and put in jail? So in this context, I should also say that these new Muslim women's groups that have spearheaded this kind of reform, particularly put their support and weight behind the triple talaq law, they have also raised wider questions about family law, about how to achieve justice in respect of family law. What are the modes of justice that work? How do you enforce laws or indeed court verdicts? How do you involve the community in the process of reaching verdicts and delivering justice? So this is not only a question of good laws and bad laws, but addresses the whole legal and justice system. Now we come to another moment in 2019. So the triple talaq law is passed. BJP wins a second term. Triple talaq law is passed. And very soon after that, only a month after that in August, you have the Kashmir crisis. And then an escalating crisis with the CAA, NRC, and NPR. This is not an audience to whom I have to explain these things, I'm sure, but I'll just take a minute to point out that the Citizenship Amendment Act provided that persecuted minorities in 3 of India's neighboring states, which are all Muslim majority, will be given citizenship on application and proof of persecution. Hindus, Jains, everybody, that is, excluding Muslims, even though Muslim sects are also persecuted minorities in some of these countries. So the CAA seemed to focus on Muslims as the only exclusion for naturalizing citizenship. Along with that, the National Register of Citizens, the NRC, the plan was to create a register to tackle the problem of illegal migration. And it was argued that this was mandated by the 203 Amendment to the Citizenship Act of 1955. It was implemented in Assam from 2013, but the government of India had redrawn the map and wanted to implement it again for the rest of the country in 2020. The National Population Register was a register of the usual residents of the country. It contains information collected from the very local level, village, sub-town, sub-district, etc. This is not a census. It is not the NRC. But it is, people feared that the NPR would be the basis on which the NRC will be formulated. So there was enormous power given to local officers to determine inclusion and exclusion from the NPR. So this created a great insecurity among many sections of the population who feared state surveillance of a kind that India had not known before. And there were protests for different reasons. The protests began in Assam first and then spread quickly to Delhi, Meghalaya, Arunachal Pradesh, Tripura, across the country. And on 15th December, we had major protests in 2 universities associated with the Muslim community. Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi and the Aligarh Muslim University. Allegations are that the police forcibly entered the campus of Jamia, used batons and tear gas on the students, and more than 200 students were injured, while around 100 were detained overnight in the police station. Similar brutal force was used in Aligarh Muslim University as well. This snowballed within a few days into an attack on the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Again, the story that is told is around 7 p.m. A masked mob, allegedly of the ruling party, armed with iron rods, sledgehammers, sticks, and bricks, attacked the campus, injured students and teachers, vandalized the hostels. Police stood by, watched, did nothing. It is against this backdrop of enormous unrest across the country that you get the Shaheen Bagh protest. In a little park in Delhi, women from neighboring areas congregated, and it was a women's sit-in demonstration which lasted from about 15th December to 24th March, which is more than 3 months. What are its characteristics? I would point to 6. First, that it was a leaderless protest. There was no political party involved. Second, that it expressed solidarity with other movements such as student movements, workers' movement, Kashmir issue, etc. Third, it inspired similar protests across the country. For instance, in Kolkata, many of you may have known that a similar protest happened in Park Circus, but also in Gaya, in Prayag, in Mumbai, in Bengaluru. Across the country, in many cities, you had similar style protests. The fourth issue I would flag is that the police were prodded into extraordinary security measures for a peaceful protest of women. As a precautionary measure, Delhi police barricaded all the neighboring major highways. They had over 10 companies, about 1,000 personnel assigned to Shaheen Bagh. Fifth, the blockade became a campaigning issue in the 2020 Delhi Legislative Assembly elections. The blocked road affected more than 100,000 vehicles a day, adding hours to some journeys. As the area is also the border point into the capital, thousands of trucks had to be diverted. So it was not an inconsequential protest. And lastly, the protests reached the courts. 5 petitions were filed to stop the blockades. Finally, the matter reached the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court desisted from ordering the women to leave the site. Instead, they appointed 3 mediators to start a conversation to end the protests. One of the Shaheen Bagh protesters, 82-year-old Bilkis, has now been listed, as you may know, in the Time magazine among the 100 most influential people of 2020. And she also figures in the BBC's list of 100 women. So Shaheen Bagh protest made it to a global list of protests. So what makes Shaheen Bagh so special? Several things could be said, and why I have gone back to Sultana's dream to talk about Shaheen Bagh. In Shaheen Bagh, you see the partition legacy, because it is once again a question of Muslim citizenship, of the Muslims who stayed behind. That it included the elderly and children to give it a community cohesion. And the fact that it was a women's protest with men's support. So for a brief while during Shaheen Bagh, you had a situation where women occupied the public space and men played supporting roles, including in the home. And it transcended, in a sense, gender and religion. So in that sense, Shaheen Bagh invokes Sultana's dream on many counts. It is not men versus women, but it is the time when men and women were able to come together on an issue to do with their community. I will stop with two testimonies. These are not testimonies I have collected myself. They were both reported in various news items of that time. So one is Abida. Abida is a young mother of 3 children who lives near Jamia Nagar. And she was asked why she put in so much effort into coming to Shaheen Bagh. Just before I move to Abida, there was this case of Nazia, which made the headlines when it happened. Nazia had taken her 4-month-old baby boy to the protests, and he died after catching a cold. And she was asked, and she said she was willing to sacrifice her children for the cause. Abida said that she was inspired by seeing what happened to girls in Jamia. It could be tomorrow, it could be my daughters, she said. And the most, to me, evocative statements she made. So farmers have been saying at the Delhi border the last few days that we are farmers, not terrorists. Abida said at that time, we are housewives, not terrorists. But Chanda Yadav is interesting because Chanda Yadav is not herself Muslim, but she participated wholeheartedly in Shaheen Bagh. She's a first-generation university student, and she said that while she understands her family's opposition to her participation and their social conservatism, to her it is important because they are my friends and this is my university. So I stop with Chanda Yadav's statement just to remember that some of the women who participated in the protests in Jamia and in Shaheen Bagh are now in jail within this raging pandemic. And could we say that some of these young women are walking on the path that Sultana's dream had shown them?
Thank you, Samita. I noticed that you haven't lost your touch for telling fantastic stories. I remember how you used to pick out in MA. I was just a year junior, but I used to be fascinated when you used to pick out an issue and then create a story from it. So I'm really glad that you still have that charisma. I was just wondering if you could add to your discussion this fascinating story of women's movement, actually, which you have given to us in such a lovely story form. I was just wondering that in the Sultana's dream, for example, I think she mentioned two different areas where there were similar situations, not that the two countries were different. But in India, if you as an academic believe in a pluralistic society that India is, unlike the Hindutva dream that they have, is that in every state the CAA problem is different. So will the women's movement or reforms that you have been talking about, will they be able to overcome local variations? As Shaheen Bagh, as you have so well demonstrated, is actually a demonstration which has been apparently able to integrate and present a unified forum, a unified picture. But do you think that these demonstrations will be the best way to also help specific issues? Because ultimately it's the specific issues that need to be addressed. You know, rather, of course, demonstrations are vital, because that is the first time that the people who are not allowed to speak have a voice. But what do you think, given the fact that every state in our country has a different problem, do you think specific issues will be able to be dealt through demonstrations?
Yeah, both excellent questions, Sharbani. And I can't say I have answers for these questions because they are ongoing issues. But the legal question is actually one that is now in much wider, I think, debate. And that, I think, is an important context for us to keep in mind, which is that how did we designate Hindu and Muslim and Parsi and Christian personal laws? Each of these personal laws are themselves the product of enormous homogenization. And perhaps nothing shows that better than the Hindu law, which was created by riding roughshod over customary variations of caste, of region, of different schools of Hindu law, the Daibhag and the Mitakshara, and other regional variations of Mitakshara law. So in fact, when we think of personal laws as the index of difference, we are actually taking something that was itself violently, a homogeneity was violently created in colonial, by the colonial state, as a marker of plurality. So in fact, one way out of this personal law versus uniform civil code debate is to look at how personal laws themselves represent multiplicity. And to abandon this desire for homogeneity. So we now have a school of thought which advocates legal pluralism. And one of the aspects of this new Muslim women's organizations and their demand, I think, is interesting because they're looking at community-based, not community as in the Muslim community, but community as in local communities, proximate communities, being able to talk about what justice, how justice. So what constitutes justice in a particular case and how we will impose that or produce to achieve that justice in particular cases. So a more case-by-case approach, a more local and community-based approach may be the way forward for family law. But of course, we can't do this without a framework. At the moment, we don't have that framework. And this may be one way, one strand in our movements going forward. So that is one answer to your two questions. The second is about demonstrations. I think in 2019, we were facing a situation where people were not sure of the value of demonstrations. New forms of political action were happening, and people were getting there were a lot of question marks about public disorder, about creating inconvenience to people. And we know, for instance, in our state that a party which had come to power through public disruption then decided to take a strong stand against public disruption, and I think reflected the mood of the time in doing that. But after 2019, demonstration has now come back to its own again. And I think the country, the anti-CAA demonstrations across the country showed that, when you're pushed to the wall, ultimately people will and can only take to the streets. And it is still, after all these years, the most powerful weapon people have against the state. Because ultimately the people are the weight of the political weight of the people is in their numbers. And how do you make that number tell? You can only make that number tell by the physicality of the people. And I don't think I think demonstrations are very much making a comeback across the world. So not forgetting Black Lives Matter and what happened in the USA in the middle of the pandemic. And I think the post-pandemic social dislocation, economic challenges, we may see a lot more, not less, but more. And there is, of course, I totally take your point that demonstrations also have localism. And different languages of protest work in different localities. But nevertheless, just if you take the idea of the demonstration, at the core idea of the demonstration, I think it's actually, we are going to see much more than social media, a return of physical politics.
Thank you very much, Samita. May I now hand over the proceedings to Nobunita for questions that she might want to ask.
Okay, thank you so much, both our chairperson, Professor Shorbani Guptu, and to our keynote speaker, Professor Samita Sen. I would now like to request Famia, our student, to pose the questions before ma'am. Famia, over to you.
Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, there weren't any questions posted on the chat box.
Okay, that's okay. I would put an end to this inaugural session, but let me first congratulate my teacher, Professor Samita Sen, for such an exhaustive and thought-provoking talk that she made us listen to, and we were totally, mesmerized by the entire gamut of the topics that she covered, and it was really brilliant, ma'am. So thank you, ma'am, and for also vindicating our belief in the force and cause of popular demonstrations. And with that note, let us put the inaugural session to a close. And now I would like to invite and request our principal, ma'am, to chair our the first technical session, that is. And for that, I would also like to invite our two speakers, Professor Chandler and Professor Sengupta, to join ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Navneeta. I assume that everybody can hear me clearly and well. What I have to say is in itself quite simple, and it won't take long. But I would like, first of all, to thank very sincerely Dr. Paul and Dr. Mitra for their gracious invitation, and to say how very delighted I am to join you all on such a special occasion. I'm talking to you from Chichester, which is a small cathedral city in the very south of England. And in many ways, Chichester is a definition of English provincial life in sometimes a rather self-congratulatory way. But at the same time, Chichester does have a particular claim to fame in terms of British and Indian history. In October 1931, the then Bishop of Chichester, George Bell, invited Gandhi to come and stay for the weekend. And he duly turned up. And this remains something of significance in the memory of the city itself. I'm also aware that talking to you, as you are, most of you in Kolkata, I'm finding a way to connect with the resting place of C.F. Andrews, Gandhi's friend. And he remains a particularly interesting figure for those of us who look into areas like this in universities in this country. So altogether, I'm very glad to join you and very conscious of all kinds of themes that unite us, even across our computer screens. Now, what I have to say in many ways represents a mixture of the personal and the historical. And you will know how to interpret that and how to relate to it and how to assess it. It's not always the case that historians are at their best when they're talking about their own families. And there are all kinds of obvious reasons for that, which I'm sure all of you will understand quite readily. But in talking about Helen Mary Morrish today, I should be talking about my own grandmother. And I think I wish to say at the very beginning that our relationships with our grandparents are curiosities in themselves because they're generally confined to certain periods of their lives, certain periods of our own. In short, I knew my grandparents when they were elderly, and they knew me when I was very young. You could argue that I knew them when they were past their most active prime. And at the same time, it would be easy to argue that they knew me before I'd had much of a chance to achieve very much. And this meant that in many ways the conversations that we had were defined by the themes and the subjects that often define the relationships between grandparents and young grandchildren. Well, the relationship I had with my grandparents was a very regular one. Before the day of computers, we relied heavily on the Royal Mail, and letters between branches of families passed regularly every week. And every week, my grandparents sent a long letter to my parents, and inside the envelope, there would be 2 postcards. One postcard would be to my brother, and one to me. Now, my brother was very artistic, and so he got some very nice postcards. I was rather younger and rather more mediocre, so I got some different kinds of postcards, but I've chosen 3 here because I've managed to hold on to them over the years. And they give you a sense of my grandmother as I encountered her and her voice as I first heard it. Now, I should say that I've resisted any temptation to produce any kind of technological feast for you. I've decided to keep everything very simple indeed. So I shan't show you these, but I will just read you one or two short extracts. This is dated the 14th of September 1978, when I was 12. Dear Andrew, so glad to know that you enjoyed your visit to Marlborough with its interesting buildings and bookshops. We're happy to know that you have settled in well at your new term at school, and we send you the happiest of wishes. I have a book for my birthday. It is called Take My Hands, the life story of a Syrian Christian doctor who has always lived in India. It's quite exciting. It's just a paperback. Would you like it when I've finished? Here's another one, perhaps of a little earlier. And in this, a certain amount of my grandmother's interests comes forward more clearly. Dear Andrew, sorry I haven't a more exciting card. Thank you ever so much for the Henry Moore card. The lithograph is very typical of some of his work. I like others better. And here's a final one that shows that my grandmother's supply of cards was perhaps dwindling somewhat. Dear Andrew, so your cricket has started. Good. And you are still collecting books. What will you do with them all when you've read them? I hope that I have not sent a copy of this picture before. I have one that you sent me. Well, my grandmother was a figure very much of my childhood. And the home that my grandparents shared was in many ways very unobtrusive. It was a small bungalow in a seaside town. And if you walked through the front door, you would find very little that was conspicuous or striking about it. There was very little furniture. Everything that went on there was conducted at a level of simplicity. And only if you looked rather more closely could you identify things that were more unusual. The first thing, in fact, was the most public. It's conventional in a seaside town, perhaps still, not only to accept that your house has a number, but also to give it a name. My grandparents gave their house the name Matondo. Well, the word itself would have seemed quite meaningless in this country. And in fact, it was Kikongo, the word peace. Inside the house, there were the usual bits and pieces of grandparental and parental life, family photographs, and so forth and so on. But there were also ornaments. And the ornaments were unusual. There weren't very many of them. But some clearly came from very different worlds altogether. And then the books on the shelves. A 2-volumed English Kikongo dictionary, for example. There was a sense also that the furniture was not quite as you might expect. My grandfather conducted his affairs from a hardwood desk situated in the bedroom. But the wood from which the desk was made was certainly not a wood that would have been found anywhere in this country, or indeed anywhere in the European continent. My grandmother died when I was a student, and on her death, a memorial resolution was sent to the family from the General Committee of the Baptist Missionary Society. And it read briefly as follows. Helen Mary Morrish began her missionary career as Helen Palmer when she went to India, where she served with the BMS from 1928 to 1931. And throughout her life, she maintained a deep love for and interest in India, its culture, and its people. Hers was a quiet personality, and she was perhaps seen mainly in her supportive role in all the many activities of her husband. But she had her own very distinctive contribution to make through her work among women, especially the wives of pastors and teachers, and among the local women and girls in whatever area they were living. Through her outstanding artistic ability, she was also able to make a valuable contribution in the training of students, and through her illustrative work for educational and Christian literature and Christmas cards. I don't know about you, but I always find it rather sobering when I have to listen to a long life condensed into just a few paragraphs, whether those paragraphs turn up in a eulogy at a funeral or in an obituary in a paper. My grandmother had no public name, no great reputation, and she earned no obituaries beyond that one. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that time passed, as it always does, and sometimes rather quickly. Memory, however vivid it might be, soon wanes and sometimes fades. And in my own mind, the sense of the landscapes that were my grandmother's own became almost mythical, almost the visions of a legend. I had the odd experience as a student when I was at Birmingham of seeing at least something of a landscape that had once been very much her own. I think some of you will have heard of the Selly Oak colleges there. The Selly Oak colleges were a very important aspect of international missionary educational training and learning for much of the 20th century. My grandmother was taught at a place called Carey Hall, named after William Carey, of course. She had a wonderful time there, and a number of photographs exist of her and her friends enjoying the grounds, relaxing and learning together. But in my time, Selly Oak colleges effectively closed down. They were handed over to the University of Birmingham and became part of that extended campus. Things certainly do change, and much has changed in this country. The world that my grandparents knew and inhabited has certainly altered a great deal. Now, many of us have a sense of our grandparents and even great-grandparents within the context of small and often treasured family archives. But a few years ago, I encountered my grandmother again. And it was in a very different context, and it was in a very remarkable way. I was doing some work at Regent's Park College in Oxford, formerly a Baptist college, still very much an institution that understands itself in those terms, but in every other respect, very much an Oxford college, very much like the others. I asked the archivist there whether any material existed in the Baptist Missionary Society archives documenting the lives of my grandmother and grandfather. And I was told that there were 2 files. I had to go there for other reasons, so I had a look at these 2 files when I arrived. They were very inconspicuous, brown files laid on my desk, not actually inviting very much attention at all. One was very slender, but the other was actually rather substantial. And I had a most extraordinary experience. My grandmother's handwriting on those postcards had been integral to my growing up, to my childhood, even actually my sense of what nice handwriting looked like, a model, I'm afraid to say, that I have altogether failed to emulate. When I opened the more substantial file, I suddenly saw before me the handwriting again. And this time, the handwriting was of a young woman. And the first letter I looked at read as follows. SS Mantola, the 1st of November, 1928, British India Steam Navigation Company Limited. My dear Mrs. Bowser, it was a great disappointment not to be able to see you, so we could say farewell at Liverpool Street, which is a main London railway station. But we quite understood. We certainly had a great send-off, and a far nicer one than the strict Baptist missionary who was on our boat. There was a prayer meeting and hymn singing for him. Thank you ever so much for all that you have given us. We are enjoying the voyage very much now that we are out where everything is calm and bright as regards the weather. We had a short service on Sunday, taken by the captain, but the Sabbath evening was spoilt by a terrible noise the second-class men made as they spent it gambling and drinking. But I suppose we see them at their worst on board. Thank you, too, for all your good wishes. Yours with love, Helen. What struck me very much about this was that the handwriting was at once recognizable, but at once strikingly different. And of course, having seen her in the context of our own familial relationships, I was now seeing her in the context of quite different relationships. What I was really seeing was my grandmother as someone who was not my grandmother, but a young, expectant young woman stepping out into the world and making her way. Now, the letters sent from India are vivid. They give a very strong sense of what she thought she was doing there, what she wanted to do with her life altogether. Interested in art, committed to education, determined to work with women of all ages and particularly with children. She had become, in a sense, part of a large picture of international exchange of various kinds. What came of all of this is documented by the file in the Regent's Park College Library, but also is part almost of a family self-understanding. In 1928, at a missionary conference in this country, she had met Edgar Henry Morrish. Edgar Henry Morrish was a young missionary who had been working in the Belgian Congo. His first wife, an American, had died of tropical disease. And in 1931, Helen and Edgar decided that they would marry and spend their lives together. But they did not spend their lives together in India. To my regret, in a sense, but certainly to my grandmother's regret, she moved. She married my grandfather in 1931 and lived from 1931 to 1957 in the Belgian Congo. When she returned to this country, she committed her life to school teaching and she retired. Now, in many ways, as history students, we tend to insist that personal narratives belong in wider contextual frames. And when we have satisfactorily placed someone in a frame of one kind or another, we like to suggest that we understand them. We find them perhaps very much figures of their time. And we often think that we can see them moving through that time in a way that's comprehensible to us. I'm a little resistant to that. I don't know about all of you, but it seems to me that we're not consciously living our lives in contextual pictures as they unfold. There is something in all of us, I think, that generally belongs to a much wider picture than our own time, our own age, our own immediate environment. But at the same time, when I look at my grandmother as a history student, I do recognize that she does take her place within a number of contexts about which we can really be clear many years later. First of all, the context of the missionary work that went on in the first half of the 20th century. I was rather disappointed when I was told by the archivist at Regent's Park College that rather little work is now being done on missionary societies in exactly that period, whereas a great deal of energy is committed to the 19th century. To my mind, the 20th century, the early 20th century, is a particularly interesting period. It's an age in which Christian missions were very much part of the grammar of British Christianity altogether. Not yet had they been divided from the domestic narrative and dispatched to some other category in the background. It was all part of one picture. And what was also important about Christian missionary work in this time is that British Christianity in the early 20th century was, in a sense, far more of a mass movement, if you wish to use that kind of language, than it certainly is now, and had in fact ever been before. This is very interesting, because it meant that in many ways it was an age of the Christian laity. People's sense of the churches and of Christianity altogether was not narrowly defined by the clergy and a sense of a Sunday morning service. Borders had been pushed out very much further. And within those extended borders, a figure like my grandmother and my grandfather, neither of whom were, in a sense, ordained in the ordinary life of the church, could be found. Not only could they be found there, they could be found living very busy, very active lives indeed. What drove them was not some rigid, dogmatic agenda. They were interested primarily in living useful lives. And the Christianity in which they found their place, excuse me, was one that expressed that powerful moral vision. And that was why it interested them. It was, in a sense, useful. It created a framework in which people lived useful lives and committed themselves to the welfare of others. And as far as my grandmother and my grandfather were concerned, it was particularly in the areas of healthcare and education that useful life could and should be lived. And it should be lived in the world. It shouldn't be lived in an immediate neighborhood. Now, much has changed in those terms, and having worked for a few years in a theological college, I found it interesting that the missionary enterprise was often regarded by students as a source of awkwardness, in fact, of embarrassment, not least because it was regarded as something that was part and parcel of the problem of imperialism. The second context in which my grandparents' lives occurs is undoubtedly that of an age of empire. What did they think of that? Well, one could argue, of course, that they were living in the age of national empires before it was superseded by an age of transnational corporations and empires of that kind. But as far as they were concerned, the British Empire was the world, the reality that they inhabited. It was the grammar of life. There was no necessary sense that it was wrong, but there was a strong sense amongst Christian missionaries, no less, that it needed to be reformed. But one has to think, I suppose, about the way we inhabit our world today and how much we take for granted. If we want to move around, if we want to be creative or productive, if we want to do useful things, we work with what is actually there. And that was very much the spirit in which my grandparents lived. It would be true, I think, to say that their view of the world was not primarily political. It was primarily ethical, moral, religious. The rub between Christian missions and empires was very explicit to both of them, not least in their later years in the Belgian Congo. That my grandfather first grew towards a decision that he wished to commit his life to Africa came when newspaper reports of the atrocities of the Belgian government there under King Leopold made its way to his attention when he was still quite a small boy in the first decade of the 20th century. Now, I think it's important to suggest a third context. And this is a context which has only quite recently become significant and interesting to historians in this country. And I think that interest is frankly long overdue. In the first half of the 20th century, a British liberal democracy found itself increasingly drawn to the agendas of what one might call a liberal internationalism. Liberal internationalism was a repudiation in so very many ways of the nationalism that reached its catastrophic culmination in the Great War of 1914-1918. Liberal internationalists were committed to international government, the League of Nations, international courts, and the various other articles of furniture which we inherit today, which affirm in many ways that the rights of individuals cannot simply be abandoned to the politics of nation states, but become part of a wider, indeed a universal picture in which we should all play a part. And that liberal internationalism has been eclipsed by the Cold War in the second half of the 20th century, and by various other competing forms in the new age that is our own. The point, I suppose, is really this. As far as my grandmother and grandfather were concerned, just because a country was many miles away, we didn't have a right to exploit it. And just because a country might be many miles away, you had no right to regard it as any less real, any less important than what might be going around in your own neighborhood or in your own country. This is, in a sense, a sensibility, an awareness, a consciousness. And it certainly shouldn't be taken for granted, least of all, I think, in our own age. Now, it's been suggested that we should ask ourselves the question whether the things to which we are looking stand up and stand up to the test of time, I think was a phrase that Nabanita used earlier. I think that three ideas occur to me with which to finish this contribution when I think of my grandmother and her years in India, and both of my grandparents together. Firstly, it is the importance of idealism. Historians very rarely write about idealism. And in a country like mine, they find writing about religion actually quite awkward. Not a lot of it actually is going on in history faculties. But I think idealism cannot be taken for granted. It has days of great significance, but it can also retreat. And in Britain, the idealism that became so powerful an ingredient in the mix of interwar British politics and life was striking in achieving, apart from anything else, the welfare state on which we rely, not least for the treatment of those suffering from COVID-19 in this country to this day. It was immensely creative and it was extremely constructive. And Christianity found its place within what has been called, in a sense, the progressive narratives of British society, and the progressive narratives which found a place within the relationship between British people and those of other countries. The second thing I would want to say about my grandparents was not simply their idealism, but it is that their values were actually and essentially non-material. They lived their lives very simply indeed. And for them, this was the only meaningful and relevant and Christian way to live. They had very little money indeed. They had very few possessions. And when I think about the standards by which they lived now, I realize how much more cluttered British life has become with possessions in an age of consumerism and affordable mass-produced products. The appeal to simplicity is not simply part of Christian life or the life of the great religions. It has become meaningful to us in an age in which we recognize that not everything is simply limitless, that our resources can be exhausted, and that material possessions in abundance inevitably divide us from our neighbour, from people of different societies, and from the needs of the world itself. The final thing that occurs to me in these terms is that in many ways my grandparents lived within a big picture. Certainly they were a very small part of it, but as far as they were concerned, that wouldn't really have mattered. The time that my grandmother spent teaching young Indian girls to draw was, as far as she was concerned, fundamental to her understanding of the world. These days, our sense of a big picture is under a great deal of challenge. I think it's certainly clear that the more we retreat to an understanding of categories, the more we lose a sense of being part of a greater whole. And that is, I think, fundamental. My grandmother would have regarded nationalism in any form as something that was essentially irrelevant and counterproductive. As far as she was concerned, the world itself was the issue, and that was the context in which she sought to find herself. And that remains the context in which I look to her. I don't find that when I look back at my grandparents, I'm looking at a distant age, which is full of manners and mores that we have left behind, and perhaps rather gratefully. What I find in my grandparents was a very firm and an explicit encouragement to think of a bigger picture and not to look backwards, but actually to live and look forwards. It would have been a great delight to them both to think of me in this rather incomprehensible technological world, which had hardly occurred when they died, talking to you here today, listening to you and learning from you. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Professor Chandler, for an extremely illuminating talk. And much of what you said really resonates with us, because of our historical position. As a Christian college, albeit it is not a missionary one, but it was started out of Christian initiative. And so it has a firm grounding in those theological values. And so we can, connect with what you have been saying. But before I attempt a summary of your beautiful and enlightening talk, I think I should say a few words about you. That would be in order. And so I would like to introduce our first speaker of the first technical session, that is Professor Andrew Chandler, whose talk we have just had. He is, as we have heard, the Professor of Modern History in the University of Chicester. And he was formerly the director of the George Pell Institute at the University of Chicester, and before that at the Queen's Foundation for Ecumenical Education in Birmingham. Professor Chandler has authored several books predominantly on British religious history in a variety of political contexts and controversies, lecturing on British, European, and American history. Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, Professor Chandler is a member of various other societies and boards as well. So I thank you for a deeply interesting talk with its exquisite evocation of memories largely personal. You have spoken about the bond between grandparents and grandchild. You have spoken about the bungalow by the seaside with its hardwood furniture and shelves of books. And you have also touched upon the initiation and training of your grandparents for Baptist missionary life. You have touched upon the trajectory of the British Christian missions in India. And not least, you have negotiated the problematic terrain, which is very difficult, where competing ideologies are very difficult to reconcile. As for example, the political imperatives of the imperial project of the British Raj in India. How does one, kind of reconcile that with the missionary impetus, which was primarily an ethical one, as you said. So it has been an extremely interesting talk, and you have explored the intersections of history and personal memory. And this exploration offers fascinating glimpses into a lived reality. We get to see the entire narrative from the point of view of your grandparents, particularly your grandmother, Helen Morrish, and what it meant to her. And, it's a very micro kind of a perspective on what was essentially a much larger project and perspective. And we have thoroughly enjoyed your talk. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not difficult for us, to be able to appreciate what you have been saying, because as all of us know, India, and particularly Kolkata, is a repository of residue of the British Raj. And, everywhere you go, you get these reminders of that colonial period of our history. And so it's there in the air, as it were, very vibrant. And of course, it offers a lot of opportunities for research in the area. So thank you, Professor Chandler, once again, for a deeply insightful talk, which seeks to bring together two different strands of a narrative, as you mentioned, the personal and the public, And in so doing, you have really traversed a difficult terrain, but one which, in its liminality has offered us indeed a very interesting glimpse into life of that period, different locales, different cultures, different countries, as also different ages. Thank you very much. And now I shall ask Famia Aska to please come up with the questions. I'm sure some questions are there for Professor Chandler.
Good evening, ma'am. There aren't any questions in the chat box yet.
So I throw it open to the house now, to all our participants. If you would like to make any observation, interjection, ask a question to Professor Chandler. Well, I have a question for you, Professor. Have you been to Kolkata?
No, I haven't. Actually, it's 20 years since I've been to India, and I'm afraid that was the other end.
Okay.
I was in Kerala, which a friend of mine from Tamil Nadu said rather disapprovingly that this was not the real India. So I'm afraid that I haven't been back since. But I learned a great deal there and was deeply grateful for the visit.
There is the Baptist Mission Church, which is located on a very arterial road of our city. And when you were talking about the Baptist mission, I was at once reminded of this edifice, and the work that is carried out by the Baptists in the present context. And of course, our cemeteries are there, which are a rich treasure trove of, people, the British people who had come to India and had served here. So
it sounds very wonderful.
Thank you. And so I shall now move on to our next speaker, the second speaker in this technical session. And she is Professor Maitreyi Sengupta. Professor Maitreyi Sengupta had long been associated as a distinguished faculty in the Department of History, Shri Shikshayatan College, Kolkata. An alumna of Presidency College, Professor Sengupta has served on the board of several important institutions: the Netaji Research Bureau, the Academy of Civil Services, the Indian Cancer Society, to name just a few. She has also been a member of the Indian Association for Asia-Pacific Studies. Professor Sengupta has participated in national and international conferences and has several publications to her credit. Her abiding interest in literature has perhaps been instrumental in honing her love for recitation, which remains her forte. Her wide-ranging interests in the world of art and aesthetics has led her into associating herself with Rango Kurmi, a leading theatre group of Kolkata. Professor Sengupta's topic today is Rani Jhansi Brigade, neglected and forgotten from the seams of history, yet glorious. So now I invite Professor Maitreyi Sengupta to please present her paper.
Thank you, Madam. I don't think that I deserve all these nice words about me. But in any case, I accept, I acknowledge all these words about me now. Well, here in this conference on women in history, I feel privileged to present before you a resume of the Rani Jhansi Regiment, an army exclusively of women volunteers under the leadership of a woman. This army was the creation of Subhash Chandler, the eternal rebel of Indian politics. It is a saga of some heroic women, which might be regarded as a milestone in the history of struggle for emancipation of women. The Indian national movement galvanized millions of people of all the classes and ideologies into political action and brought to its knees a mighty colonial empire. The pre-nationalist resistance movement to colonial rule gradually developed into one of the greatest mass movements in world history. Throughout this period, Indian women did their share in the struggle. Women's participation called into question the British right to rule and legitimized the national movement. The formation of Jhansi Regiment is an event, unique event, I would say, in this trajectory. Well, much has been written on Subhash Chandra, the towering personality in Indian politics, which provides us graphic details about his political career from the early days till the climactic years of the last phase, 1943 to 1905, when he started the last war of independence of his country from abroad with his army, the Azad Hind Fauj or the INA. The Jhansi Brigade was a women's wing of the INA, an army exclusively of women volunteers under the leadership of a woman, Captain Lakshmi Swaminathan, who held the post of cabinet minister in the provisional government of Azad Hind. This was a unique event, unprecedented and unbelievable at that time, and also for times to come. Question is how to perceive these women, about whom we lack such substantiality. The situation reminds me the well-worn phrase, the personal is political, the theory of American feminist Carol Hanisch. According to this, autobiographies, life histories of revolutionaries, their reminiscences and memoirs, and plethora of evidence from oral history document a lived history and meld the politics of the personal with the politics of the contemporary times. These are extremely valuable sources to construct the history of the Jhansi Regiment. It is my privilege to experience this process of personal political integration due to my long association with Netaji Research Bureau. The veterans, the men and women of Azad Hind Fauj paid annual visit to Netaji Bhavan in Kolkata, the ancestral residence of Subhash Chandra, during the annual birthday celebrations of their leader, organized by the Bureau. My association with the Bureau gave me the opportunity to come into close contact with them, to listen to their talks about their army and their leader year after year. Many a times we had intimate interaction with these remarkable personalities that acted as an inspirational force for me to study about the Rani Jhansi regiment. It struck me as one of the rarest events of history, neglected, forgotten from the scenes of history, yet glorious. My thanks to the organizers of the conference, which has given me the opportunity to share my knowledge with you. My special thanks to Professor Nobonita Mitra, the chief architect of the event, and respectful regards for the chairperson, Dr. Ajanta, Principal, Women's Christian College. After these formalities, I move to the topic. I would like to mention just one incident before we start our discourse. Year 2006, Lieutenant Susmita Chakrabarti committed suicide while in service. The comment of the then Vice Chief of Indian Army, S. Venkataramavan, was that women lack fighting skill, the ability to take decisions at moments of crisis, and women's presence in army creates nothing but problems. This is a revelation of the attitude of majority of men towards women, which has percolated through the ages from generation to generation. All these are known facts to you, you who belong to the Department of Women's Studies, but I just mention them as a background. Barring few exceptions, facts of history prove the truth of this observation. Manu, the ancient lawgiver, prescribed a permanent dependent status for women to be protected by the male members of the family in ancient society. The Middle Ages brought forth the idea of secluded womanhood, which prevailed in the pre-colonial period and was universalized in the 19th century. The main focus of the reforming agenda of the Western educated intellectuals from mid-19th to 20th century was for upliftment of women from the degraded status, from their degraded status in society. But in their efforts for emancipation of women, they could never imagine women to be their conscious equals, claiming agency for their own emancipation. And the postmodern 21st century presents a wonderful scenario of contradictions, universality of equality of rights, blatant discrimination in the field of women's inner space and outer space, her life at home and her activities outside. The history of Jhansi regiment is to be placed in this collage of contradictions. The innumerable doubts, honor killings, the Navals construct the background of our discourse with aid. Subhash Chandra's escape from India in 1941 was a logical and ultimate step in the development of his program of action to organize the final armed assault on British imperialism. By the early 40s of the last century, the national movement had reached its final and most critical stage within the country. With the outbreak of World War II, spectacular victories of Germany against Britain and Allied powers made it clear that Great Britain was caught in the grip of a worst kind of war crisis. Subhash was convinced that the time had come for a final assault. He was also convinced that freedom could not be achieved without armed resistance. It was impossible to organize armed resistance within the country. He must organize action from abroad with Indians who had settled abroad and with the help of the Axis powers, the enemies of the British. After some unsuccessful overtures in Germany, he finally appeared on the political stage in East Asia, where over 2 million of Indians had been politically roused and stood as a solid phalanx to fight for India's liberation under his leadership. He reached Singapore in July 1943, where at a great meeting of Indians, Rash Bihari Bose, the veteran revolutionary leader, handed over the leadership of the movement to the young hero. Netaji took over the supreme command of the INA, which reached its final stage of development in the true sense of the term as an independent army. With the formation of the provisional government of Azad Hind, it became an organ of a free government to fulfill its declared policy, that is, emancipation of India through armed struggle. Rani Jhansi regiment, an integral part of this newly constituted INA, an army of women soldiers, a voluntary national liberal force. They would be fighting with men shoulder to shoulder, enjoying equal status and sharing same responsibility. Subhash alone could conceive such an idea and turn it into reality because it was evident from the beginning of his political career that he possessed much more radical ideas on social, political, and economic issues than his contemporaries. By 1920, women in India had entered all of political movement. But their involvement was mostly of a supportive or indirect nature. Though the metaphor of Mother Goddess has been permanently inscribed in Indian nationalist discourse, and the myth about woman as symbol of Shakti or primal power had always been an inspiring force, women could hardly come out of the accepted gender ideology that prescribed home as the rightful arena of activities for women. They had been asked mostly to weave and spin, to boycott and picket foreign goods, and to sell khadi. Subhash went much beyond this stereotype. From the early days of his career, his encouragement of women to live a full life and devote themselves to an ideal just like men went much beyond his contemporaries. He asked Latika Ghosh, an Oxford-educated teacher, to form the Mahila Rashtriya Sangha in 1928, an organization of women which espoused an ideology much more radical than its sister organizations. In the same year, he had uniformed women volunteers to inaugurate the annual session of along with their male colleagues wearing saris like uniforms. Interviews published in the national newspapers then during the 30s revealed that he was determined to bring women more fully into the movement. Geraldine Forbes, that the women revolutionaries of Bengal regarded him as a living figure who encouraged their activities most and was undoubtedly Bengal's greatest champion of women's rights. The formation of a women's brigade, therefore, is a logical development of his ideas about the capabilities of women, about their rightful place in society. After two perilous submarine journeys from Germany to Japan, Subhash appeared on the political stage of Asia, May 1943. After reaching Singapore, he began a continuous, tireless trailblazing campaign for organizing and consolidating the Indian independence movement. Huge mass rallies were held almost every day. Each came all sections of people, the members of the Indian Independence League, representing Indian revolutionaries from all over Greater East Asia, civilian population, soldiers and officers of the INA, formed under Mohan Singh, all desperately looking forward to the leadership of the new leader. at one such rally on 9 July, where all residents of Singapore had assembled. Netaji took over the supreme command of the INA in presence of the incidents of He then gave a call for total mobilization of the entire human power of East and Southeast Asia, fight the last battle for freedom. Women's Brigade after Lakshmi Bai of 1857 would be an integral part of it. Lakshmi Sagar, the eyewitness, records that the final first reaction was stunning silence, then was complete disbelief of all the fellow partners. Veteran members of the INA and Indian International League felt that it was absolutely impossible to raise such an army because women in Southeast Asia and East Asia were not educated, mostly confined within 4 walls of home, without any knowledge of the outside world. Situation in Burma was more or less safe, except the case of few enlightened families. The Japanese violently opposed the idea. They thought the experiment would mean sheer wastage money and valuable military equipment. You find the same mindset after all these decades. In the year 2006, when Venkata Raghavan, the vice president, just uttered these words. Despite all oppositions from all quarters, that he was determined to have the brave Indian women to form a death-defying movement who will build the soul of the death-defying regime, will build the soul as the brave Rani of Jhansi in India's first war of women. He asked Lakshmi, then I am not, and the most active woman in Singapore, who had already organized an exclusively women's honor for Netaji to organize a women's rally. As Netaji addressed the women, all the witnesses came that the entire assembly stood up and surged towards the dais, volunteering to join the regiment then and there. Thereafter, women in Malaya and Singapore thronged the office of the ILL for enlistment. Baba, says Manavati Arya, Indian women flocked to my regiment, and those who could not become soldiers extended help in various other ways. It was only with 15 women that the regiment was initially formed. Netaji and Lakshmi started recruiting in the mainland to great effect. Within a week, the number was 50. Recruitment to the regiment exceeded expectations very soon, and a full-fledged women's department formed at the headquarters in Burma. There is some confusion to the exact strength of the sorry, it's creating much trouble. Hope I am audible now. Within a week, it started with 15 women, and within a week, the number was 50. Recruitment to the regiment exceeded expectations very soon, and a full-fledged women's department was set up at the headquarters in Burma. There is confusion about the exact strength of the army, but recent researches of Joyce Weber prove that there were at least 2,000 women there, 1,500 in the training camps of Burma, Malaya, and Singapore, while 5,000 in the nursing camps and support of innumerable others. Recent researches prove that the training camp was joined by women from elite as well as working class families of all religions and castes living in Southeast Asia. Some of these charmed soldiers of Netaji soon became prominent and discharged their duties most efficiently. Maitreyi, our teacher of Vishwabharati Academy at Rengu, was the first secretary of the Women's Department. Maya Banerjee and Aruna Banerjee, daughters of a PWD engineer, affluent and educated, came from a family which joined the regiment. They became soldiers at a very young age. Janaki Davar was one of the many volunteers from Malay who had never seen their motherland. M.S. Naidu, Satyavati Naidu, was Deputy Chief of the Singapore unit. These are well-known names because they held important positions in public life later on and had left their own accounts. But there were the other women as well who formed the bulk of the army, and their contribution was no less. We still do not know much about them. If there is confusion with regard to the number of soldiers of the regiment, there is no confusion at all about the intensive, rigorous, highly pressurized military training which the women soldiers underwent. All the members of the brigade who have recorded their experiences of the military camps claim that so far training was concerned, they did everything that soldiers are expected to do. Netaji had told Lakshmi, "Don't think that I want to have this regiment simply as a showpiece." And the accounts of Janaki, Lakshmi, and others make it clear that the soldiers were also aware that their army was not a showpiece. The central training camp at Singapore was formally inaugurated on 22nd October 1943. Though training had started from July onwards, camps were also started at Thailand and Burma. The senior experienced officers of INA were given the responsibility of training the women. Netaji himself selected them, interviewed them, and selected the best among them for the purpose. They were the veteran officers of the British Army. They knew their job very well and performed it very well. The day for the Rani started at 6 in the morning in the training camps with PT, followed by infantry drill, regular march, and training camp for handling all kinds of firearms. Classes were held on military tactics, map reading, jungle warfare, warfare at night, etc. In the evening, girls had to attend lectures on Indian and world history with special reference to freedom and revolutionary struggles of people all over the world. Those who proved their excellence were promoted to the senior grade and given special training meant for officers. Lakshmi could not avail of this kind of training. As being a cabinet minister, she had to go to Rengu quite often with the High Command to make preparation for the real battle. She was very much included in decision-making process, while in Congress, women never enjoyed that privilege. During Lakshmi's absence, Major M.S. Naidu became the deputy chief of the Singapore unit, which underwent 6 months of non-stop training. When the first contingent with 500 women soldiers was sent to Burma, there were 8 senior officers among them who had received their commission. Janaki was one of them. It reached Maimeo in early January 1944, and the soldiers had to undergo further rigid training in guerrilla tactics, jungle warfare, warfare at night, and advanced nursing courses under the command of Major Mahbub Ahmed and Major Ratuli. In Maimeo, they had a real taste of war. War was blazing them. Their camp was completely destroyed by enemy bombing, and it was the trenches which they had dug saved their lives. In the midst of everything, training went on as usual. Lakshmi says that their only desire at that time was to go to the Imphal front, where real fighting had started. But soon after came the news of retreat from Imphal, and the chances of women to advance to the front were none. They experienced all the horrors of the war through the sight of ill-equipped, wounded and sick INA soldiers brought from the battlefronts of Imphal, Kohima and Arakan. The women who had set out to fight now took on the role of nurses and rendered their services unbearably. Unscrupulous bombing of hospitals was a part of the happy game of Anglo-American pilots, and the entire area was subjected to carpet bombing. It was not only the hospitals, but the Jhansi camp was also bombed many times. But even then, it was turned into a huge nursing center. The men and women of INA were brought closer during these worst days of crisis, sharing miseries and sufferings together. It was a unique bond of fraternity among the comrades. Even then, the women kept on with their military training, doing long night marches, and still hoped that they would get the chance to advance by early next year. But gradually the tide of the war turned completely in favor of the Allied forces. Japan's communication system collapsed. Its navy was defeated. Japanese soldiers were retreating, fighting back slowly to the war. Victorious Allied powers, with all the resources at their disposal, were steadily on towards Rangoon to evacuate the occupied areas of Southeast Asia, and there was no other alternative for the regiment than to retreat. Most had started early that year, April 1944, to worsen the situation. In 1944, the Rani Jhansi women agreed to move to Rangoon and then back to Malawi. None of them wanted to go back and protested bitterly. But like all soldiers, they knew that they had to obey the order of the Supreme Commander. In Rangoon, Netaji had all the volunteers recruited in Burma sent back to their homes, and he personally escorted the Malayan volunteers back to Thailand. The Japanese begged him to leave by plane or by car, as the British recapture of Rangoon was imminent, but he refused, as he felt personally responsible for the safety of the soldiers of the regiment, which was his own creation. Janaki gives us a graphic description of this marathon war from Rangoon to Bangkok, covering more than 23 days through virgin jungles and the most difficult terrains. They had to move in grinding darkness, crossing turbulent, breachless rivers and streams, marching in total disregard of hunger, thirst, or fatigue. On several occasions, they were fired upon by Allied guerrilla forces when the regiment had its proudest hour of protecting their Netaji. They took up positions and beat back the attacks. 2 members of the regiment lost their lives during the journey. On completion of the war, they were ordered into a camp. By that, Germany had already surrendered, which was followed by Hiroshima and Nagasaki and surrender of the Japanese army. There was a prospect of imprisonment for the soldiers as the British reoccupied Burma and Malay. But for the Ranis, it was neither defeat nor surrender, because they were imbued with the spirit of their leader and believed that the struggle would continue in spite of temporary reverses. Lakshmi chose a different course of action. She wanted to use her medical training for the wounded and devoted herself to Maimyo's INA hospital, next a hospital at Zeawadi, and finally joined the new hospital at Palau in the dense forest of Shan district in the hills of east of Maitreyi. Finally, she came to England and got the job of a doctor in a clinic at Mughal Street. She had the guts to observe the anniversary of the provisional government of Azad Hind on 21st October in the bombed out city of England with a few comments. She was detained once again and finally sent back to India. The speech of the Ranis blazed forth when they were brought before the British officials for interrogation. The soldiers of INA had been already rounded up and sent to POW camps, and next came the turn of the Ranis. The British had their biggest surprise when they started interrogating the women. The women turned up in their tattered yet clean uniforms, and on entering the room, they saluted and shouted, "Netaji Jindabad, Azad Hind Jindabad." The British failed to extract confessions from them that they had been forced and tortured to join the regiment. The women demanded that they should be sent back to India at POWs so that they could share the punishment with their male comrades. They refused all offers of hospitality and proudly stated that they had the regiment voluntarily and had no regrets except that they had not been able to defeat the British. They also refused all offers of special ration to them or jobs for their members of their families. This undaunted spirit of the women could clearly prove that INA was a voluntary army fighting for a cause, neither an army of renegades nor a puppet army controlled by the superior military force of the Japanese. It is difficult to explain how could Netaji's cause bring about such a change in the psyche of all sections of women from war-torn Southeast Asia. Young, educated women from well-settled families influenced by anti-British propaganda carried on by Indian Independence League for a long time had influenced some women, the educated, enlightened ones. Lakshmi herself had a political background, as her mother was actively associated with Congress and a Congress MP. She was the most visible and most active young woman in the whole of Singapore and was naturally drawn into the movement. Recruits from Burma had close ties with their motherland, and the revolutionary activities of Bengal must have influenced them. Lakshmi said that as young people live in Southeast Asia, they lacked a sense of identity. Netaji had made them feel that they were Indians and who would have to play a vital role in the liberation of the motherland. This kind of feeling might have inspired the educated, this kind of feeling might have inspired the educated, enlightened youth. But hundreds of common women, old and young, even women of labor plantation of Malay, were also roused by Netaji's call. There may be exaggeration in the nostalgic accounts of the members of the brigade, written immediately after the war. But there is no doubt about the fact that the response of a large section of women was tremendous at that moment of crisis. Netaji could manage to excite the love for India and the determination to set it free among women who had not seen this country or had any idea about it. Another distinctive feature of the regiment, which differentiates it even from the main body of INA, is that it did not have a single member converted from the British Indian Army. Recruited and trained under the direct influence and inspiration from Netaji and headed by Lakshmi Saigal, the members of the regiment, like the Ranis, came to be the pure INA. Their achievement in sheer military terms is nothing because they did not have the chance to fight. The historical importance is that this decision to mobilize women throughout East Asia for national service meant a very big step forward in the fight for complete enfranchisement of the women, Indian women. Colonel J.K. Banerjee, a close associate of Netaji in those early days of feminism, could feel it. Joyce Leblanc affirms that this experiment certainly amounted to a significant enlargement of women's role in nationalist politics, from the passive role model of mythic Sita to that of the heroic activism of Rani of Jhansi. Indeed, Gandhi's Dragon Corps had politicized larger sections of women, but he also accepted the natural division of labor between the sexes. Home basically is a domain of women. Due to biological weakness, women cannot claim equality with men. Sita, Draupadi, Damayanti should be their role models. But these women had proved that biological weakness does not matter. They were equal with men in that regard also. They did not have to fight for equality. Equality with male comrades was the foundation of the brigade, the most striking feature. Peter Fay throws a new light on the relationship between Netaji and INA. Netaji, in spite of his long and successful political career, before left for Southeast Asia, is mostly remembered for his military daring. The two climactic years from 1943 to 45 proved to be the best years of his life when he emerged as a military leader who made a determined bid for independence through armed struggle. It was possible because of his army, the men and women of INA. If they had not existed, he might have been reduced to mere portion. It was the men and women of INA and Jhansi Brigade who made all the difference, and the significance should not be underestimated. Lakshmi regrets that the sacrifice and struggle of these women outside the boundaries of the country have been overlooked and ignored after the independence. Those who came from Burma had been sent back to their homes, but no arrangement was made for their rehabilitation. Those who were from Malaya and Singapore were not given the citizenship of the country for which they were even denied the chance of visiting their motherland. Therefore, though some of them, like Janaki or Lakshmi, played leading roles in various fields afterwards, they could not find a place in free India which had nothing to offer to them. And they were the worst victims of red tapeism. They did not get their pensions. The lot of the few who returned to India were not only denied of the meager pension of freedom fighters, some of them died in abject poverty. This state of affair leaves no doubt that this regiment of women, first of its kind in history, faded away completely with the transfer of power. There has not been any space for it in India's pantheon. In fact, the INA itself is a forgotten army, as Peter Fay calls, though it fought a true war of independence from desperate months and became the decisive agent of Britain's departure. If INA with its 4,000 people, its women legend is merciful, as it happens in games of women, to prove the truth of Rani's doctrine, that under colonial rule, the female subaltern is deeply in shadow and has no history. Thank you. I could not go into the stories. Stories really reveal more than this kind of written document, but I have to give the facts. To give the facts, I could not tell the stories, the wonderful stories of regarding these men and women, particularly of women of the regiment. And I hope this has made clear at least the basic structure of the regiment and its importance in history. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sengupta, for an extremely enlightening talk. And we were really enthralled to see how you discussed Netaji Subhash Bose's extraordinary role in the Indian national struggle, how you spoke about his formation of the Indian National Army against all odds, his influence not only in India but in the entire South Asian space, along with the formation of the Rani Jhansi regiment in the Indian National Army. It was fascinating how you touched upon Bose's liberal views on women's ability and agency, and also his belief in their actual military capability, as he did not intend the Rani Jhansi regiment to be seen as a mere showpiece, but he wanted it to be seen as a very real fighting unit. You also spoke about how he mobilized female energy not only for active combat in the Second World War, but also for those related services which are of crucial importance in such a situation. In this regard, as in other senses, we realized that Netaji was indeed a visionary and a radical thinker who was not afraid to subvert stereotypes and challenge conventional assumptions. Professor Sengupta, you have wonderfully recuperated a discourse that, notwithstanding the controversies attending it, resonates with a particular nostalgia in the popular Indian mind. In an increasingly shrinking social space and the proliferation of sexist and other biases, Netaji's progressive ideas and actions stand testimony to a liberal ethics which is sorely needed today. I thank you for a fascinating presentation, and there were a few technical interruptions, and so the seamless transmission couldn't be ensured. Nevertheless, we were able to hear you, and I'm sure all of us, we are all really enthralled by your talk. And now I would like to ask Famia for questions. I'm sure some questions are there in the chat box, Famia.
Good evening, ma'am. There aren't any questions posted on the chat box.
Oh, that's disappointing. But I'm sure there will be some interjections from our participants. I think, ma'am, you have to unmute yourself. Professor Sengupta, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. Arvind, can you please unmute Professor Sengupta?
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah.
Yes, Professor Sengupta.
Do you have any question, you yourself, madam?
Well, I have a very kind of a layperson's view of things, and I would just like to ask you that what would you regard to be the causes which have succeeded in what I believe the marginalization of Netaji in the national discourse today?
Yes. No, there is only conflicts and some very stupid ideas, I must say. Whether he married, did he die, and things like that. Nobody knows that in such a short span of life, he wrote 12 volumes on politics, on philosophy, and gave a graphic description of India's past and the present, which he visioned. It is wonderful. There are 12 volumes in Netaji Research Bureau, in the library of Netaji Research Bureau. And there are photographs taken at that time. He reaching Singapore, the women of Jhansi of Rani sitting together. I've got the pictures, but I was not sure about the quality of the, this net. Therefore, right. I did not bring them. That might create more disturbance. One should keep in mind that he was the eternal rebel of Indian politics. He never agreed to the policy of appeasement, which Congress High Command followed at that time. He also did not believe that though passive resistance is very good, violent resistance is definitely a way of getting independence, but side by side, violent action is necessary. Unless an armed assault was there, the British could not be driven back away from India. And he gave the explanation in a historic letter to Gandhiji, where he said that I do believe that you have given the leadership for all these decades in the struggle, in the history of struggle for Indian liberation. But you have seen the situation now, 1942. The whole country was turned into a jail. All the leaders sent back. The movement was not at all. It has lost its momentum. And then Gandhiji also agreed to this. When they were put in jail, he also had to accept that do or die. Do means take active action. Therefore, I think one should go through his writings, one should go through his works, one should go through his, views, and missionary as well, and according to that. Am I audible?
We just lost the connection, but now you are.
That is, there are so many controversies with regard to him. So many. He had a dictatorial streak and things like that. These are there. You do not find a personality in history about whom there is no dissent. Dissenting voices are always there. Lenin suffered from venereal diseases. Mao Zedong turned out to be a worst kind of dictator. These things are there, but we must look at the other side, which is the positive side of the energy. And from that point of view, I think he holds a unique position. His concept of Hindu-Muslim unity, his concept of equality of women. I really think that these are the most important elements about him. There you find him in his true elements.
Thank you, ma'am. And if there are some other questions, observations.
I thought there would be many questions on it. All this is based on oral history, memoirs, reminiscences, as I have told before, reminiscences of the women in action. That is, the members of the Jhansi Brigade. And the written accounts which they have left themselves.
Yes. What I felt was that he has not been given due credit, and there is this tendency to marginalize him in terms of national politics, like he was an inspiring figure, and perhaps we have not really utilized the kind of legacy that he left. That is the point that I was trying to make. And that is probably because he was such an infant terrible, to the political establishment, to the conservative political establishment, and they found it very hot to handle, so to speak, right? And there was his uncompromising honesty, his liberal thoughts, you know. It was difficult to accommodate then as now.
Yes, it has been always there. Mainstream history has neglected him, and the importance of violent activities. It was not only Subhash Chandra that who did it. It was there from the very beginning. The revolutionary activities there were from very beginning. It was he who coordinated the whole thing and gave it the shape of a national liberation force. Others were sporadic, local.
Right.
But this was a thoroughly organized liberation force. And he realized that it would not be possible to do it in the country where British imperialism was at its height then, and it would crush it. Any revolutionary activity, any act of violence would be crushed by the British Raj. Therefore, he would have to organize it from outside, and this shows the internationalism, his idea that it would not be possible in Germany. But though Germany is enemy of Britain, but it would be possible in Southeast Asia, East Asia, which should be his destination.
Thank you, Professor Sengupta. And is there any question?
Excuse me. Yes, ma'am. There's a question by SNR Rizvi. That how do you assess Lakshmi Sehgal?
There's a question for you, Professor Sengupta. How do you assess Lakshmi Sehgal?
Lakshmi, first of all, as I have told you, she was the most active young woman in Singapore. She was a doctor, and her mother was a MP. Therefore, she had the medical background, and she organized a guard of honor for Netaji by women only when he reached Singapore. Then it was just like that they met each other. Otherwise, it might not have been possible for Subhash Chandra to address women like that. It was Lakshmi who organized all the rallies. It was Lakshmi who was a cabinet minister. It was she who was involved in the decision-making process. And all the time when she was not with the regiment, she did more important work. And even after defeat, she did not give it up. And later on, when she came back to this country, she opened a chamber in Kanpur with Prem Sehgal. They got married, Lakshmi Sehgal and Prem Sehgal, with Prem Sehgal, and she became Lakshmi Sehgal and carried on work for the underprivileged sections of the society. Quite a few years back, her name was proposed, but the situation is such. Quite a few years back, her name was proposed as for presidency of India, the year when Pratibha Patil became the president. And then I heard from people here, Lakshmi, who? This is unpardonable. We forget our history, and particularly women.
Thank you, Professor Sengupta. Are there any more questions? Kamya?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
All right then. I thank you, Professor Sengupta, for a wonderful talk, and we really enjoyed it and we learned a great many things from it. And I thank our other panelists as well, Professor Andrew Chandler, for his enlightening talk about his grandparents and missionary activity in India. And both the presentations were absolutely delightful, academically very enriching, and personally, on a personal level too, they resonated with us, at various levels. And I really thank both of you for your presence, for your insightful talks, and for having been with us, and for having shared your valuable time and insights with us and our colleagues and students. Thank you very much, both of you. And with that, I bring the first technical session to a close. And I call upon Navonita, Dr. Navonita Mitro, to please take the webinar forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a brilliantly insightful analysis of the two talks that you gave us, and a big thank you to our two speakers as well. I would now like to request Professor Maitreyi Sengupta to please take over as chairperson in our next technical session. And I would also invite the two panelists, Dr. Amrita Bosu Roy Choudhury and Dr. Promiti Chatterjee, to please, begin your talk with ma'am's permission. Okay, over to Professor Sengupta.
And assistant professor in the Department of History, Women's Christian College. Going through Ajanta, I find these young people are so talented that it is innate to talk about them. Very deeply, just what has done her training, holds a doctorate degree from Jhansi University. Her area of interest in of doing her doctoral research focused on imagine in Bengali literature is for children and its connection with the larger social historical trees country, exploring the historical nuances of insanity, psychology, and especially in the context of Bengal. She writes in both Bengali and English and published quite a few articles in Bengali journals like Parikatha and Anushtup. Anushtup is a very well-known journal meant for all the high-grade intellectuals. Her recent publication is from Primus, entitled Kolkata in Space, Time and Imagination, where she has authored an article named The City and its Art, Ghost Stories of Art Calcutta. Therefore, I'm presenting this bright, young talent before you, and he would speak on the theme of our topic is fear being the domestic sphere, spectral remains in Bengali literature in 19th century. This article problematizes the otherness and defiance of the female spectral figures that we usually find in Bengali literature in the late 19th century, not as she is treated not as figments of senile fantasy. The author explores them strategically concocted to reflect the nature of conflict, arguments, and in the supposed glorious and guided sphere of the middle class Bengali household and society. In the later half of the 19th century, saw the most virulent violence in parts. Historians and sociologists have meticulously charted out the merits of and merits also of these grandiose nationalist projects, who objectified women along with her power of education, emotion, and gesture. This is not in the discourse of but what about the violence? Needless to say, they were to be shunned off from society, from discussion, and from life also. She will exert the main efforts against this context. This essay will try to analyze the spectral feminines as depicted by two literatures of 19th century Bengal, Railakanath Mukhopadhyay and Rabindranath. Death is not ahistorical by nature. Death does not put a closer to life. The desires and defiances that characterizes the life of the spectral feelings discussed in this article register a cause of their return, the return of the cause, lying underneath all these fictitious and ephemeral elements of stories, and to uncover the social or rather historical intent behind the construct of these spectral. Then we are waiting for a very interesting lecture now. Please start.
Thanks. Am I audible and visible properly?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks,
Yeah.
Professor Sengupta, first of all. It's really been a daunting privilege for me to share the podium with all the luminaries while I'm just a beginner in this field. My area of talk today, I will rather recite the title once again, that is Space, Historicity and Spectral Selves, Ghost Women of Bengali Stories in the late 19th century. As the title shows, the two key themes I will be discussing today is space and historicity, and that too in the context of modern Bengali domesticity of late 19th century. The primary trope I will use to explore this connection between history and space is spectral women. Now, spectrality is rather an unconventional trope in the gamut of social science, especially when it comes to history. History has always tried to disenchant itself from any unnecessary emotionalism emanating from death and dying, and shunned them off as ahistorical. I'm not talking about Philip Arias because he always stood as an exception in the genre of history, because he dealt with two thematic historical processes, childhood and family, and the other one was death. But the relationship between historicity and space, which is one of the most crucial tools of studying history, acquires a novel dimension when spectrality is used as an investigative modality, especially in the context of the colonial cities and their early urban history-making process. So I will talk a bit about my way of using the trope of spectrality, because for spectrality, people usually look back at Derrida. And Derrida has identified this typical spectral trope as a liminal identity straddling between two completely different states, opposite states rather, like suppose presence and absence, past and present, and so on. And according to Derrida, when a text gets haunted or rather spectralized, it acquires certain open-endedness. It becomes inconclusive. It becomes indefinite. But I'm not really going into this kind of thematic complexities of Derrida, because Derrida has divided spectre and phantom as two different identities. Phantom belong to the past, while the spectre is having some pro-futuristic values. I'm rather putting my spectral trope very simply as a Levinasian other, as philosopher Levinas put the otherness as an absolute one. It is not kind of a very abstract or absurd kind of otherness, or like that of any cognitive dissonance, but it is rather kind of a very constructed, concrete kind of otherness that you can confront face to face. And it is coming from an extremely different world. So that will be my first lookout. The way I will try to put my way of using spectrality in this talk. And the second dimension that I'd like to touch upon is its area of atemporality. Because we all know that the historical construction depends on two major grids. The one is spatiality and the other one is temporality. The spatial context is given quite specifically over here. That is the late 19th century Bengali middle class domestic space. So it is given. So I will be playing with the other motive, that is temporality. So let's see how this definite spatial context and an indefinite temporal context create, or at least try to create, a redefined vision of history. I'm just giving a very sketchy preview of my clusters of talking today. The first, I will be talking, rather posing the first section of my talk against the background of the colonial cities, which tried to use the spectral trope for its administrative purpose. It will be a very sketchy preview just to delve into the innermost recess of the society later on, that is domestic space. And in the second section, I will be talking about the domestic space, the construction of the domestic ideology, the positioning of women in it. And I will be picking up a few examples from two leading literatures of the 19th century that, as Professor Sengupta has already mentioned, Trailokyanath Mukhopadhyay and Rabindranath Tagore. And thirdly, I will try to reach the conclusion, but obviously with a jest of inconclusiveness. So let's see how this trope can be contextualized against the background of the colonial cities in a post-1857 scenario. Refurbishment of the colonial cities after 1857, as Wiener Oltenburg shows, emphasized three principal agendas: safety, sanitation, and loyalty. Its execution entailed a concerted effort on the part of the British government to cleanse the urban limits of the major cities like Calcutta, Agra, or Allahabad from any unsavory association with the physicality of death. Several municipal measures were devised to disassociate the visuality or emotionalism of death from the civic life of the living. For example, we can cite Reverend Long's account that gives us a pretty verbatim record about how the alternative routes were created in Calcutta to carry out the funeral processions outside the public gaze, which could have otherwise impacted adversely the tender feelings of the refined white women. Keeping today's theme in mind, I'm not delving too much into these materialities of death and administration, but it is getting clear that this sanitization of death, which was an overtly administrative emergency for stemming the cities back once again to control and regulation, created an ahistorical register for death and memory. A very interesting paradox lies in the process by which the nascent modern civil society was being barricaded from any visual reminder of death and simultaneously weaved a lot of ghost stories into its ideological texture. Be it H.E.A. Cotton's early handbook about the city of Calcutta, Bastard's rigorous cataloguing of the early Gothic buildings of the city, or Warren Hastings' personal account, the early British records never really failed to relate the city with the most significant phantom figures of the Raj. Perhaps these stories invested the cities with a particular historicity through the sinews of memory and their continuous evocation. It was a sense of absolute colonial historicity that legitimized its claim of past and power on the colonized space and naturally delinked it from any connection with its indigenous cultural moorings. Spectrality thus created its own kind of historicity, and once endowed with that, the space acquires specific cultural underpinnings. It becomes more significant when the modern domestic sphere comes within its purview. It has been really exciting to see that the early spooky rumors of colonial Calcutta or any story dealing with the apparitions never crossed the threshold of the domestic space. As far as the nature of the indigenous ghosts were concerned, their locations and domiciles played a very crucial role in fixing their socio-cultural status and characters. Belghat, Shauraghat, marshland or Jola, the unhygienic and improperly groomed shabby corners of Calcutta Blacktown were associated with specific spectral characters. Not only male, but females too, once dead, were allocated an outside domain. I have sifted a few examples from Trailokonath Mukhopadhyay's writings. The ghost women in Mukhopadhyay's imagery roughly resembled to that of the pre-modern ghost women of Bengali folklores and oral culture, who were mostly brooding in nature, persistent in their feeling of devotion and dedication towards their loved ones, mostly husband, but expelled from the familiar domain of household after death. I just would like to speak a few things about the typical replication of the Freudian terminologies, because in Uncanny, Freud made a typical division between homely and unhomely. Once you are alive, you are perfectly within the comforts and safety of your home, then you are homely. And Freud mentioned it as heimlich. And when you are not alive, you are not within the precinct of your home, your typical measured paradigm of safety, then you are unhomely. That is called unheimlich. So this typical division of heimlich and unheimlich is also being replicated over here in Bengali literature as well. The VP females in Trailokonath's Konkaboti, Lullu, Kano Eto Nidoy Hoile, Muktamala, and a few others reflect the archetypal female sentiment centering round their uninhibited love for husbands, the devastation of their small homely world at the extramarital affairs of those husbands, and the subsequent processes of their desertion, courtesy, the entry of the second wives, and their final submission in the name of unrequited love by incurring death. Mukhopadhyay depicted one ghost woman as cheated and murdered by her husband, who relentlessly asked a single question to all the passers-by, "Keno eto nidoy hoile?" People were scared of passing through that area after sundown. The glorious image of a Bengali middle-class woman's Shutitto and her exceptional fortitude in front of every odds did not flicker a bit as Joshoda, another brooding one from Mukhopadhyay's menagerie of ghosts, chose to be equally loving and caring to her husband who wronged her, remarried, and for whom she committed suicide. The sense of an irreparable loss loomed large within her spectral self as Joshoda, even after her physical death, could not transgress the ethical boundaries that the society of the living thrust upon her during her lifetime. Once a good and devoted housewife, Joshoda still remained so, and soliloquized a rhyme as she roamed all alone in the midst of a marshland. Quote, "Poti songe ekshate shoti thake sukhe, Joshoda petini hita thake mono dukhe." Poor Joshoda was sad when she was alive. She continued to be sad when she was dead, and ever after. It is interesting to see how all these chaste housewives are being stripped of the normalcy of their domestic space once they turn spectral. The modern domestic space is extremely particularized in this context. It is not unexpected, however, that under modernity, the domestic space emerged as the sanctum sanctorum of the Bengali middle-class self. The scrupulous separation of home and work, public and private sphere, and the strategic deification of women as the greed of Bengali middle-class morality and honor transformed the home into an abode of uncontested spiritual authority and cultural linchpin for the Bengali middle-class men. It was a space for ideal submission and devotion for their womenfolk, not to be tempered with a slightest sign of non-compliance, or rather deviance. Mukhopadhyay's brooding females were conformist by all forms and gestures, but still they posed very naive question to the basic functionalities of the domestic arrangements. They were denied the access outright. The safety and sanctity of the domestic space was to be preserved at any cost, even at the expense of the lives of its inmates. It is not surprising, therefore, that the mortality rate of the young widows and the housewives was staggering continuously during the years like 1864, 1870, 1876, 1880, and so on. Naturally, Joshoda gathered a humongously large crew, and multiple spectral followers never questioned the reason behind their abrupt dislocation. But where Tagore's spectral women fundamentally differed from Mukhopadhyay's lies in the way they crossed this quintessential sacred boundary. They lay bare the frailty of the ideological structure of the domestic space, its unquestioned dominance of patriarchal identities, and the emptiness of the notions like safety and security associated with that. With an unparalleled urban sophistication and a deliberate psychologization of fear, Tagore's distressed heroines reflected something more than a naive defiance. They embodied a powerful deviance instead. His unique sensitivity reflected through the early string of short stories like Konkal, Monihara, or Nishithe registered this deviance with a subtle eeriness. Monimalika showed a pathological attachment to her jewelries. She hardly cared for her husband and left him outright with her most coveted treasures. But her return became so significant as she crossed the sacred boundary and unsettled the domestic space with the deepening sense of disquiet and paranoia. The fear intensifies as the author so meticulously described the vividness of her return. I quote, "The sound crossed the guardless gates and entered the inner chambers of the house, began to climb round and round the circular staircase, across the wide veranda, stopping for a while as it came to the door of the bedroom, unquote. Tagore quite purposively outlined and emphasized every minute details of her bedroom. The cloth rack, the tea table, the empty soap box, the lamp, the scattered dried betel leaves. Everything described the familiar domestic space where she used to play the central role. But these same objects became obnoxiously terrifying as they got transformed into the chief signifiers of Moni's spectral return. I quote again, "The sound caressed every object, crossed the threshold and entered the room," unquote. Why does the spectre need to underscore its intrusiveness as evidenced from this passage from the outer world to the inner? The answer lies in Tagore's usage of the metaphor of cremation ground or Shoshan Bhumi for the home. Moni Malika died a brutal death, but she was not broody like her predecessors. Rather, she brought back the dark wildness of outside into the domestic space, the innermost bastion of middle-class safety, comfort, and security. She turned the home, which used to be an associative of life, into a dead space, with no possible sign of respite. Similarly, the young widow in Konkal draped herself in her crimson-red Benarasi sari as she set herself free from any social injunction and resisted with an ultimate vengeance by murdering her lover. Seclusion, silence, and powerlessness that had overpowered her entire existence as a living human being came to an abrupt rupture as she donned her spectral self. Her illicit affair might have elicited no sympathy from her family because her corpse and her skeleton were purchased for medical dissection. But she did not shy away from narrating her story to even an outsider. She came back with an unforeseen resolute to demand a sanction for her doing. I quote, "I killed him. I'm no sorry for that," unquote. Fear, dread, and paranoia consume the reader as the ever-submissive, silent, and docile housewife in Nishite came back with the most unconventional gesture of her lifetime. She dared to question the intimacy of her husband with his newly wedded wife. There was an embarrassment, a mischievous pleasure, a disbelief, and a hint of sharp ridicule in her query. Okay, go. The subdued bitterness in her question, accompanied by her uncanny laughter, unnerved her husband and affected his conjugal relationship subsequently. Now I come to the conclusive part. These spectral women became so dreadful not only because they invaded the threshold of the zealously guarded patriarchal domestic space, but they questioned the integrity of those high-sounding values, those the native men appropriated on their lives to forestall the sweeping waves of modernity. Home became isomorphically related to the outside, which was absolutely impervious in its authority and knew no other. I am citing a few metaphors used frequently in contemporary journals to identify that glorious image of home. Like Mahisha Mohila once described the home, as an oasis in the midst of a desert. In Abola Bandhab, we find that it is described as the only resting place in the midst of unending misery of outside. Jyoti Ringon, another weekly that was mostly from 1840s and 50s, that referred to the home as the sacred inner space. And women were seen as the forebearer of this undisputed legacy of home. But somewhere deep down, an anxiety was brewing within this discourse of domesticity itself. Remember Krishna Bhavini Das's critical analysis of Bengali household in England Bhadra Mohila that was composed in between 1882 and 3. And that too was a rendition by a woman herself. And as we proceed, we are coming to the 1890s, the most turbulent age of consent, which obviously forged a lot of opinions both in favor and against this discourse of Hindu middle-class domesticity. In these stories, however, the climactic point is reached as these women, once so integrally associated with that space, represented the challenge to its entrenched notions of security, coherence, and imperviousness with their spectral presence. Home, the innermost recess of Bengali bourgeois self, turned into a morbid space with all its safety gone. And as these females were both deviant and insiders, there was no more assurance that the closed doors of the home will ensure ultimate safety and security from the unsettling discomforts of the outside. Hence, the spectral women in Tagore's works were neither as dead enough as to be sealed off and ahistoricized forever, nor they can be analyzed by using the conservative Freudian normative of the return of the repressed. They were not repressed at all. I guess their association with spectrality empowered them to rebel against the familiar power structure of middle-class domesticity. As she came back and revisited every familiar object she once used, as she reminisced about her secret craving and her innocent love that she was bound to leave behind, her spectral self goes beyond the calibrated notions of middle-class femininity. It refutes the structure of the linear model of history as well. She reshuffles the status quo of the domestic space by imparting an amazing historicity to both space and time. It is disturbing but productive at the same time, as it harnesses the power of the other to disrupt the homogeneous discourse of Bengali domesticity. The present time disappears from the space and becomes so tangled that it ends up looking atemporal. It creates a non-chronological order which is similar to the Delusian concept of cinematic time. Their spectral presence defines a complete withdrawal of empirical succession of time, past, present, and future, makes history out of joint, and provides an alternative context where the normative symbolic scaffolding of domesticity is breaking apart to formulate a new and a more empowered vision of feminine subjectivity. Home, albeit for a stipulated time, emerges as a women's space regulated by only her choice, which numbs off men completely. Naturally, the terror loomed large as the men were losing their last grasp of control. The temporal grounding of their self-identity got shaken while confronting these spectral females within the precinct of their home. Home became a convoluted space for men, a space of unsettling fear, which now validates the entry of the other within and intensifies their dilemma and allows a reverse power play. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramiti. It's a wonderful paper. I missed quite a few part of it, portion of it, due to this technical problem. But I have got most of it. Am I audible?
You are. You are audible.
Very interesting. So what is the time limit now? Because it is already past 7:30. Isn't it so? How long will this seminar go? Because I would have to. How long would this seminar go?
As for the
I think I'm not
continue up to 7:45. But I think one more speaker is left. So have I got any questions as of now? We can do it together if...
Is there any question? No, let us do it separately as it has been done previously. Well, is there any question? Then you would answer to these questions first.
Ma'am, there are no questions.
Okay, thank you.
No question. Prabhiti,
yes.
It's a wonderful, very paper, very well written, extremely well written, and a very interesting thing also.
Thank you, ma'am.
You have dealt with something. Well, I'm sorry that I cannot talk in details about it, but you have mentioned all the important factors here: their spectral females, their desires, their defiances after that, their the cause for difference in life, that aspect morality of say has created its own historical sanity of a colonial states, the distinction between the homely and the unhomely, the domestic space at that time was loud, proclaimed the home a domain for women. It provides women with safety and security, but actually it is not that. And their attempt somewhere is an protest against the attempt of the Bengali middle class babus to forestall modernity. Spectral women are empowered to question domesticity, reshuffles the domestic setup, and remain rebels. More or less, this is basically what you have tried to point out, but this is a very well-researched paper, and I thought there would be questions, but since there's no question, I'm moving to the second speaker.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Good evening, and since we have already overstepped time and my presentation has been rescheduled without any intimation, let me do the technical part first. Let me share my PPT first in order to avoid further delay due to technical glitches. Arvindji, please see whether it is visible to everyone. I'm just sharing my screen right now. Yeah, first and foremost, I'm extremely elated to be a part of this, Started International webinar. And I'd like to thank my teachers, Shoma Chatterjee, Nobonita Mitra, Kushal Vishwas, Juma Shandal, Chandrima Mondal for shaping and molding my academic career since my days at Women's Christian College. And I feel really honored to share this platform with my teacher and mentor, Professor Samita Sen, who has always invigorated me to venture boulevards of unending dreams. I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Ajanta Pal, Principal, Women's Christian College, Dr. Ratna Pandey, Secretary, Women's Christian College, and to the distinguished speakers, Professor Andrew Chandler, Professor Maitreyi Sengupta, and Dr. Praniti Chatterjee, and also to my mentors, Shikha Paul and Mohua Roy from Lady Brahman College. Now, to talk about my presentation, since I will be focusing on Bengali print advertisements, my presentation will be sometimes a bilingual one. So here goes my topic. So I will be speaking on the topic, I'm no bird and no net ensnares me, True Lives of Bengali Print Advertisements of Post-Pandemic Kolkata. See, the first section of my title itself is a quotation from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and I will try to unveil the true lies as evident in the construction of gender roles in Bengali print advertisements. So, before I share the objectives of my study, I would like to add a few words. The word advertising or advertisement originated from the Latin word advertir. It meant to turn the mind towards something. Although the messages of the advertisements are most often short, but they are very powerful, persuasive, and influential in shaping the attitude and the behavior of the society at large. So David Ogilvy, in his legendary book titled Ogilvy on Advertising, states that advertisements are more of a medium of information rather than being just a source of mere entertainment or creativity. And in Goffman's terms, advertising serves to define or frame reality, and thus the social impact of advertising cannot be overlooked. So we very often perceive that advertisers are willing to exploit our gender identities in order to sell products. Therefore, construction of gender roles in advertisement becomes a crucial field of study. And this study basically attempts to, examine how the gender roles have been constructed in Bengali print advertisement published between March 2020 and December 2020. Since my time frame is post-pandemic one, that's why it is focusing on this particular phase. And it also aims to locate the shift in the portrayal of men and women in the advertisements. And it employs a qualitative content analysis method. As I have mentioned that the advertisements are mostly collected from 4 Bengali dailies, namely Anandabajar Potrika, Ei Shomoy, Shangbad Pratidin, Ajkal, and it's basically from the Kolkata circulation, Kolkata edition of this particular papers. So these are the 4 newspapers or dailies I have used to gather information. The next one. Let me tell the theoretical framework I'm using here. And first, I'd like to, introduce the gender role classification I'm using here. The gender roles portrayed by the central character in the advertisements have been classified into following 4 categories. Number 1, the decorative role. And for every category, I have used certain references. So Zotos, in his legendary article, Images of Women in Online Advertisements of Global Products, Does Sexism Exist?, published in 2008, categorized decorative role for women under broad 2 categories. First, concerned with the physical attractiveness, and second, as sex objects. Apart from the attire, the posture and gestures of a character play a vital role in determining and giving shape to this role. See this photo, the woman here is coming in decorative role. The next one is the working role. In the present study, the category of a man-woman in a working role includes the portrayal of a man or woman as professionals like a doctor, a lawyer, a politician, a spokesperson, an interviewer, a model, or any other profession which is considered to be professional in nature and whose main focus is on work-related activities. So although this man is working from home, which says still, I will consider him as the professional because during this particular situation, all of us are working from home. The next one is the family role. In the current study, both men and women are depicted within the private space of a family and playing the role in making decisions relating to family or informing about a product, which is a domestic household family product or service, have been assigned a family role. Just look at this. 3 of them are enjoying a moment together. The next one is the freewheeler role. A freewheeler role depicts a person as a fun-goer or party-goer or an adventurer, as pointed out by researcher Retd, Freewheeler role in majority of the instances are more acceptable for a man than a woman in the Indian context. So this freewheeler role, they are having fun. Now talking about these are the gender role classification references. I'm skipping it right now. The next one, the product classification. This is a classification provided by David Stokes and Wendy Lomax. I'm using their classification for my research, for my paper rather. Different types of product broadly include fast-moving consumer goods, durable and service goods. During a close study of these products, the most pertinent ones I have found are home, health and personal care, food and beverages, electrical, electronic goods, industrial goods, carrier services. In the advertisement published during this particular phase I have chosen. Now let me show you some advertisement that I have collected, followed by an analysis from gender perspective. Oshini hair oil at the advertisement on Oshini hair oil is there. Two of the advertisements depict the same product. The women in these advertisements appear in decorative role with a connotation of very stylish looks through luscious hair. This is a very common stereotypical rendering of a woman in advertisements. The key objective of the character is to portray the stereotype associated with the physical appearance with respect to gender, that is, beauty, attractiveness, gorgeousness, etc., in case of a woman. So again, Goffman, in his canonical text, Gender Advertisements, records that advertisements do not portray the way men and women actually behave. Instead, they impose an artificial depiction of men and women, which is categorized by Goffman as the quote-unquote artificial look. Advertisement present women as an epitome of such an ideal beauty. You know, look at this woman, such voluminous hair. Look at the advertisement on the right side. Her mother is mentioning that she is having long, voluminous, fluffy hair after using this Ashwini hair oil. So these women become an epitome of such ideal beauty, which is practically impossible to achieve in reality. We can see Rachana Banerjee in the advertisement on the left side. She's using a mask, and the advertisement itself is promoting pandemic protocol of social distancing. So mask or samajik durotto, it is written at the top of the advertisements. But this agenda is missing in the advertisement on the right side. Same product, Ashwini hair oil. So the advertisement on the left was published in the month of May, and the right one was published just three days back on 9th December. So there is a huge change in approach. Next one. Look at the advertisement on the left, Charm and Glow. So for healthy and glowing skin, a woman must use Charm and Glow herbal facial kit at home during lockdown. And regular use of this herbal product will make the skin smooth, shiny, and glazy. The advertisement apparently seems to resist racial attitude by replacing the word fair with glow. There is a clear message of staying at home and staying safe in the advertisement, which is being contradicted by the use of the tagline, the D10 facial kit. Left bottom. See, also available D10 facial kit that is mentioned here. So D10 facial kit. How can our skin be tanned unless we go into the sun? It can be tanned. There are other ways. Perhaps the assumption comes from the notion that women of the family will be excessively involved with the culinary activities and other domestic chores, which may make their skin look dull. Look at the advertisement on the right side. There is at the top right. See on the top right, see rays of sun is there. I mean, again, metaphorically representing the masculinity. Siddharth Malhotra, the celebrity actor in the Glow and Handsome advertisement, looks like a philanderer. The advertisement apparently seems to resist, racial attitude by replacing the word fair with glow. But glow only happens when the person who is, being portrayed in the advertisement himself or herself is fair. So again, a contradiction. The next one. The most significant point about these two advertisements, Lavolia and Dettol, is that the female figure or the mother figure, has been posited as solely responsible for the healthcare issue of the entire family. In both of the advertisements, the mother figure appears as a decision maker recommending the use of either Dettol or Lavolia spray. So since this is the private space, it is her domain. Hygiene is related to the better reproduction of family ideals and values and pivots on the chaste, clean and hygienic figure of the woman also. Yes. Again, we see celebrity endorsement in both of the advertisements. On the left, Arun Govil, Hero Ramchandra in the TV serial Raman is endorsing the hand sanitizer, and Akshay Kumar on the right is also promoting Harpic toilet cleaner. See, both of the celebrities are playing a decorative role rather than being placed within the space of family. They're only recommending, but they are not, either using within the space of family or, using for their kids within the space of family. So they're having a recommendatory role here in this particular advertisement. That's the difference from the previous advertisement. The next slide. The advertisement on the left, Shusto Thakun, Rog Protirodhok Khamata Bariye Tulun. That is the tagline of the advertisement. So celebrity Raju Srivastava is again here in this advertisement, and he is also endorsing Pet Safa with some messages like how it controls acidity, gastric, and so on. And he's also talking about the immunity issues, which is a primary issue during this pandemic situation. It's quite a positive message is being communicated through this advertisement. And additionally, if we look at the second advertisement on the right side, in the Fat Glow Seeming Capsule advertisement, we can see the woman becoming an object of desire. She's unnecessarily showing her body, and that's a very common trend, stereotyping kind of thing. And there is no such messages related to pandemic, because this particular advertisement was published. It is only being asserted lockdown pore fit thakar aro bhalo upaye, how to remain fit during post-lockdown situation. But remaining fit doesn't mean that someone has to show off the body or overtly expose her body. It's a typical cliched representation of a woman. So, and we can see that this is an unnecessary exposure, and there is no such messages related to pandemic. The next slide, here we can see this is the advertisement on the left side is an advertisement on hair transplantation and mole or tattoo removal. Surprisingly enough, see, the woman is unnecessarily again exposed, whereas the effect of transplantation on men has been manifested in a very controlled manner. Only his head is being shown, and here, since the issue of tattoo is there, how tattoo is being removed, in the name of that, her body is shown in a very nuanced manner, in a very cliched manner, again a typical stereotyping. And we can see how women are always being projected on object of desire. That is an age-old depiction of women. So there was no change considering this kind of depiction of women during this pandemic situation. The advertisement on the right portrays the woman as at your service, Lord. This particular tendency is described as ritualization of subordination by Erving Goffman himself, where he finds woman lowering herself physically in some forms. So this is basically an example of ritualization of subordination. She is serving her husband tea. She's just adding the milk to the tea, or to the, perhaps it might be coffee as well. We don't know, but she could have had a different posture. She could have served her not lowering down herself. So there is a message of boosting immunity in this particular advertisement, Doodh Khan immunity baran, but a typical representation of woman. This slide here, we see both the men playing different working roles. Some walking through the path of photography. At the left side, আপনার ভালো লাগার পথ ধরে এগিয়ে যান. So pursue whatever you love to pursue. So perhaps this man wants to pursue a career, a photographic career. So that is being heightened here through this advertisement. And on the other, being a medical practitioner, and doctor here recommends Ayush as the most effective bond during this pandemic situation. So these two advertisements were published in early July in এই সময়. So the next slide. See, exceptionally, I must mention, I have studied more than 600 advertisements of this particular phase I have chosen to, study. And exceptionally during this pandemic crisis, we have perceived women as doctors and nurses in many advertisements, which is quite opposite to what we have been, what earlier have been depicted. Very few women were portrayed in the role of doctors, although many as nurses. So since I have conducted my research on advertisements from 1991 to 2010, I have consistently found women playing the role of a nurse and very few women playing the role of a doctor. But this pandemic has completely, changed the situation. Look at the advertisement at the right side, Sachi Saheli advertisement. Sachi Saheli is an Ayurvedic tonic which saves women from menstrual pain and also boosts the immunity system. Look at the position of women from left to right. See the order: actor, doctor, then comes student. All the three of the characters are women associated with three different occupations or engagements in government terms. Again, the function ranking of the actor is the highest here. Unfortunately, a visible hierarchy of profession prevails here in this advertisement. So when we say all women should be treated equally, we need to, reconsider this kind of advertisement. And of course, we need to do something. We need to raise voice against the hegemonic representation of women, because women themselves are being segregated considering their profession. Glamour world comes first, then comes doctor, then comes the student. So it's a matter of concern. The next slide. Celebrity endorsement, again with a visible hierarchy. See a close example of gender discrimination. The top left, Kadambini serial, এক গৃহিণীর অসাধ্য সাধনের কাহিনী. So although it is the narrative of homemaker, grihini in the sense homemaker, I must say. So see, Kadambini is sitting and her husband is standing there, and he has placed his hand on the shoulder of Kadambini. So there is again a kind of ritualization of subordination. Although the serial is named after Kadambini, but how Kadambini is being dependent or supported by the male protagonist of the serial is quite seemingly validated here. I mean, quite seemingly the role of male protagonist is valorized here. Then bottom left, মন ভালো করা গান নিয়ে আসছে, সারেগামা advertisement on সারেগামা. So see the male-female ratio. Look at the male-female ratio. Two women are there. Two female singers, and rest. Abhi Chatterjee is the anchor, and rest. The presence of 5 male singers is very much visible here, and the ratio talks about the relative size of the gender roles, the relative size of the gender identity, considering the number of women, we can very well say that this is a male dominated space again, And Abir is looking at the audience straight. He's facing the audience. And look at the posture of both Akriti Kakkar and Imon Chatterjee. They're facing side. So again, kind of ritualization of subordination is prevalent in this particular advertisement. Now, Ogo Nirupama, Imon Shudu Jane, Tumi Shundor Koto, the advertisement on the advertisement at the right top. So we can see a woman, not so good looking, because it's a narrative more or less like Jhansi Koi Nahi. Let us see, she becomes very beautiful. But look at the relative size of the man. He is, although the woman is facing the audience, and he is, having an angular posture. The man is having an angular posture, but still, it can be said that, considering the height, it can be said that there is the relative size is higher for the man himself. So again, a kind of low function ranking for woman. The next advertisement, right bottom, ফিরছি নতুন ছন্দে আপনাদের প্রিয় রিয়ালিটি শো এর নতুন পর্ব নিয়ে আজ থেকে চোখ রাখুন দিদি নাম্বার 1 and Dadagiri came much later than Didi number 1, but here we can see Dada comes first, wearing a white piece of Punjabi. He, flagging the idea of peace and integrity and so on. And again, Rachana Banerjee, she's wearing a red sari, symbolizing red being the color of desire or color of objectification or color of excessive sexual desire. So there are two, two different representation, two different portrayal, considering the color, and two different messages are being conveyed through their attires. And most importantly, the Rachana Banerjee, if you have a close look, at this advertisement, you can see how Dada is just, functioning. Dada is functioning strongly. I mean, strongly than Rachana Banerjee here. So again, an example of gender discrimination, considering the function ranking, because Rachana Banerjee here is having a low function ranking and having a smaller relative size compared to Dada. The next slide, the left one. Dabi korun ja apnar, that is, demand what is yours. Perhaps this woman is saving from the familial expenses, and we do not know whether she is a working woman or not, but at least she can demand what she is saving, since she is the caregiver of the family. She takes care of the entire, she takes care of all the issues of the familial space, or the domestic space. And so that's why she can demand the money she is saving, she can demand that it is hers only. And look at the advertisement at the right side. The male-female ratio here reverses the 2 boys and 3 girls. And significantly, they are surfacing in the advertisements of financial product. So it is very important that the problems or the issues related to girl child are also being, prioritized. We can see that the relative size of the girls are higher than the boys, and they are also having a stronger function ranking than the boys. So in a way, this is quite a positive representation of girl child, as we can see here. So before I conclude, a quick acknowledgement. It is, I'm not reading the names, it is there in my slide. And just I'd like to conclude by saying that there is a constant redoing and undoing of stereotyping of gender roles in the advertisements I've shown. And since human mind is extremely gullible, we have to be conscious before projecting any specific gender ideal. Still, we have to be hopeful that this discrimination will gradually fade away someday. Thank you. Thank you so much. Am I audible? Yes.
Thank you, Amrita.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you have presented a very informative paper. You have shown how advertisements, often powerful, persuasive, and influential, determine our attitude of the and the behavior of society at large. You have also clearly mentioned the different roles: gender role, decorative role, working role, family role, and how how it has been changed during the pandemic situation, where also we see the stereotypes, the effect of ritualization of subordination, valorization of the male folk, gender discrimination. From various advertisements, you have just brought them out and put them in such a wonderful way that it's extremely clear. Sorry that we do not have time, we cannot have more discussion about it, but I must say that these two papers are extremely well-written papers, informative and complete presentations. These two are absolutely complete presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Okay, let me take this occasion of thanking our chairperson, Professor Maitreyi Sengupta, and to our two very brilliant speakers, Dr. Promiti Chatterjee and Dr. Amrita Boshu Roy Choudhury, for presenting their papers so well. Famia, do we have any questions for Amrita, ma'am?
Yes, ma'am. There's a question by SNR Rizvi that how do you see the changes in advertisement with special reference to women, and do you see any exploitment of women in this period?
See, that's what I, tried to, bring forth through this presentation. So changes are always there, but there is a constant, doing and undoing kind of thing. I mean, women are, portrayed as professionals nowadays more, and we can see the face of empowered women through these advertisements more pertinent. This depiction is more evident in audiovisual advertisement, though not in print advertisements. So I cannot say that there is a huge shift, but it is gradually changing. And exploitation, it was there, it is there, but the degree is gradually decreasing. That is the thing.
Okay, so let me request Dr. Anisha Roy from our department to deliver her vote of thanks.
Thank you, Netaji. Good evening, everyone. This is a proud privilege for me to offer the vote of thanks on behalf of our institution, Women's Christian College, Kolkata. I would first like to thank our chief patron, Dr. Ajanta Paul, principal and professor of our college, who always extends her utmost help in all matters. Without her active support, this webinar would not have been possible. We are equally grateful to every single member of our college governing body, especially to our Honorable Vice President, Srimati Sagorika Banerjee, and our Honorable Secretary, Dr. Ratna Pandey, who could spare some time out of their busy schedule and join us in this program. We are immensely grateful to Professor Suranjan Das Honorable Director, and Professor Shorbani Guptu of Netaji Institute for Asian Studies for having agreed to collaborate with us. We would certainly look forward to having such joint collaborations in future as well. We would also like to pay our humble yet deep respect to the distinguished galaxy of speakers that includes Professor Samita Sen, Professor Andrew Chandler, Professor Maitreyi Sengupta, Dr. Amrita Basu Roy Choudhury, and Dr. Promiti Chatterjee, whom we have had the privilege of listening to today. In this context, we especially thank Professor Shorbani Guptu, our Principal Madam Dr. Ajanta Paul, and Professor Maitreyi Sengupta for chairing our different sessions with such finesse. We would also like to place on record our gratitude to every single member of our IQAC team for their support and to all faculty members, non-teaching as well as support staff of our college whose participation has lent encouragement to our humble endeavor. We would also like to express our sincere thanks to all our friends, colleagues, and students belonging to other colleges and universities who have stayed with us right through and enlivened the sessions with their lively queries. Special thanks goes to Shri Arvind Prasad, who made it possible to conduct this webinar with his technical expertise. Last but not the least, we extend our sincere thanks to the students, especially Amrita, Pamia, Shagufta, Rumia, Ritika, and Sheta, for their untiring efforts behind the scene. Thank you all once again. I would now like to draw a closure to this webinar of ours. Thank you.